Hey there, sleepy wasteland wanderers. Tonight, we're diving into the haunting beauty of the Fallout universe, where broken cities whisper forgotten stories, and every shadow hides a tale of survival. I'll be your guide through these glowing ruins, sharing quiet moments of hope, resilience, and the eerie calm of a world long gone. Welcome, wanderer, to the quiet dark beneath the wasteland, where a man built himself a world and sealed the door behind him. Tonight we follow Dr. Stanislaus Braun, scientist, architect, god of a pocket universe, no larger than a suburban street through 2 centuries of power, without witness and cruelty without consequence. This is a story about what the old world made when no one was looking, about paradise as a mask and comfort as a weapon. So, settle in, let your breathing slow, and allow the hum of the simulation to carry you gently into whatever dreams the dark provides. Someone is always watching in Tranquility Lane. To understand what Stanislaus Braun became, it is necessary first to understand the civilization that made him possible, not as a backdrop against which his story occurred, but as the active and essential condition of his existence. The specific culture whose values and institutions and intellectual habits shaped him with the same thoroughness that a river shapes the stone it runs through for long enough. The world that produced Braun was not a world that happened to contain evil as an aberration within an otherwise functional order. It was a world that had systematized certain kinds of evil so completely that the systematization had become invisible, had been absorbed into the normal operations of respected institutions and prestigious careers, and the daily working lives of intelligent, educated people who would have been genuinely offended by the suggestion that what they were doing carried any moral dimension worth examining. Pre-war America in the mid-21st century was a civilization at a specific and revealing point in its trajectory, past the peak of its genuine confidence, not yet arrived at the open acknowledgement of its decline, occupying the uncomfortable middle territory where a society continues to perform its foundational ideals with increasing elaborateness, precisely because the performance is no longer supported by the substance it was always supposed to express. The America that Braun grew up in and was educated within still spoke the language of progress, of scientific advancement in service of human flourishing, of the democratic ideals that distinguished it from the authoritarian systems it had spent the previous century defining itself against. It spoke this language fluently and with apparent conviction in government addresses and corporate mission statements and the educational institutions that trained the next generation of scientists and administrators and policy architects in the belief that their work served these principles. The resource wars told a different story, told it with a persistence and a specificity that the official language could not entirely muffle, regardless of the effort applied to the muffling. What began as a series of regional conflicts over oil and water and the increasingly finite supply of materials that an energy-intensive civilization could not function without gradually revealed itself as something more systematic and more revealing, not a collection of separate crises produced by separate circumstances, but the coherent expression of what a civilization actually valued when the distance between its stated values and its operational priorities became impossible to maintain. The annexation of Canada, the resource campaigns in the Middle East, the various military and quasi-military operations that the American government pursued under the justifications that governments have always assembled for the pursuit of things they require, all of these represented the same underlying logic made visible by desperation, the logic that said some lives were variables in equations whose solutions only the powerful were qualified to determine. The scientific establishment that Braun entered as a young man was not separate from this culture, but was one of its primary expressions, one of the places where the logic operated most freely and with the least interference from the moral friction that public scrutiny occasionally provided in other domains. Science, in this era, was generously funded, institutionally prestigious, and thoroughly insulated from consequence in ways that the other professions of equivalent status were not. A doctor whose patient died had a death on their record. An engineer whose bridge collapsed had a collapse to account for. A scientist whose research produced harmful outcomes had data outcomes that could be contextualized, framed as preliminary, absorbed into the ongoing project of accumulating knowledge that would eventually, if sufficient knowledge were accumulated, produce the benefits that justified the process. The specific culture of the research institutions Braun moved through had developed, across decades of this insulation, a set of professional values that functioned as a moral framework while actually displacing morality with something else. Rigor was valued, the methodological precision that produced results that could be replicated and built upon and published in journals whose standards of technical review were genuinely demanding. Intelligence was valued, the specific cognitive capability for systematic analysis, for identifying the variables within a complex system and designing interventions that tested specific hypotheses about how those variables interacted. Ambition was valued, productivity was valued. The generation of results that attracted further funding and extended the scope of one's research program was valued with the particular intensity that institutions apply to the qualities they depend on for their own continuation. What was not valued, or rather, what was present in these cultures only as a formal requirement that could be satisfied through the appropriate documentation without being allowed to substantively alter the content of the work, was the kind of moral engagement with research subjects that would have required treating them as ends rather than means, as people whose experiences within an experiment had a significance that extended beyond their utility as data points. Informed consent existed as a legal and procedural category. Ethical review boards existed as administrative structures. The language of research ethics was present throughout the institutional frameworks within which Braun and his colleagues operated, present in the policies and the training programs and the official statements of professional organizations whose commitment to protecting research subjects was genuinely held at the level of institutional self-presentation. But the culture that surrounded these formal structures, the actual operating values of the research community that shaped the daily decisions and professional judgments of the people working within it, told a different story. What the culture rewarded in the practical and immediate sense of advancement and recognition and the specific forms of professional esteem that determined whose opinions were sought and whose careers flourished, was results. Results that were significant, results that were publishable, results that advanced the field and demonstrated the productivity of the research program that produced them. The formal ethical requirements were the floor that research had to clear, not the ceiling it aspired to, and the distance between the floor and the ceiling was space that the culture had learned to occupy with considerable comfort. Vault-Tec Corporation emerged within this landscape as a specific and revealing crystallization of the era's defining tensions. Officially, it was a provider of nuclear shelter technology, a company whose product was survival itself, whose advertisements showed smiling families descending into clean and spacious vaults, while mushroom clouds bloomed in cheerful cartoon pastels above a horizon that somehow managed to look both apocalyptic and reassuring. The sales pitch was straightforwardly humanitarian in its framing. Vault-Tec cared about American families, had invested its considerable resources in ensuring that the worst outcome of the geopolitical crisis unfolding around them would not be the extinction of the people who made America worth defending, and was offering ordinary citizens the opportunity to secure their own futures and the futures of their children through the responsible purchase of a vault residence. The actual architecture of what Vault-Tec was building told a more complicated story, accessible in full only to the people within the company, who had clearance for its highest levels of operational planning, people who understood that the vaults were not primarily shelters in any straightforward sense, but were a research program of extraordinary ambition and extraordinary moral indifference, a network of controlled environments within which human populations would be studied under conditions of isolation and stress that no ethical review board operating under normal circumstances would have permitted. Each vault in the network was designed around a specific experimental variable, a deliberate deviation from the conditions of a genuine shelter that would allow the researchers monitoring the experiment to gather data about how human beings responded to specific manipulations of their social and physical environment. The range of these experiments, taken together, constitutes a remarkable document of the pre-war scientific imagination and its specific relationship to the people it studied. Some experiments manipulated the physical environment, population size, resource availability, the duration of underground confinement. Others manipulated the social environment, introducing specific conflicts, removing specific social structures, altering the demographic composition of the population in ways designed to test hypotheses about group dynamics. Still, others introduced specific individuals into vault populations, plants, provocateurs, people with specific psychological profiles, chosen because the researchers wanted to observe what happened when that profile interacted with the social environment they had constructed. The experiments were not uniformly cruel in their design, though some were. They were uniformly contemptuous of their subjects, in a way that was perhaps more revealing than cruelty would have been the contempt of people who had decided that the subjects of their research existed primarily as material for the generation of data that people more important than the subjects would eventually find useful. Braun entered Vault-Tech's employment as someone whose formation had prepared him well for this culture. His intelligence was genuine and considerable, the kind of systematic, architecturally sophisticated intelligence that excels at designing complex systems and understanding how variables within those systems interact. His ambition was equally genuine. The ambition, not of someone who wanted specific things that success would provide, but of someone who understood themselves as a person of exceptional capability, who deserved the scope and resources commensurate with that capability, and was committed to acquiring them. He moved through the institution with the ease of someone whose values, whether he would have articulated it in these terms or not, were largely aligned with the values the institution rewarded. The societal preservation program that became Braun's domain within Vault-Tech represented the intersection of his specific intellectual interests and the institution's broader research agenda. What it was designed to study, the long-term behavioral and psychological consequences of extended isolation in controlled social environments, required exactly the kind of systematic thinking about human populations as systems that Braun's training had developed and his temperament had always been disposed toward. That the study required treating its subjects as components within an experiment rather than as people with independent moral significance was, within the culture he operated in, not a complication requiring moral attention, but simply one of the design parameters of the research program. Who Braun was in these years before the bombs, before the vault, before the simulation can only be partially reconstructed from the evidence his later actions provide. He was a man of real accomplishment within a system that rewarded the particular combination of intelligence and moral flexibility his career demonstrated. He was someone whose colleagues presumably respected his work, and whose institutional superiors trusted him with responsibilities that had significant consequences for significant numbers of people. He was, by all the measures that the world he inhabited applied to the assessment of persons, a success, a contributor to the advancement of knowledge, a builder of things that would matter, a scientist whose legacy would extend beyond his own lifetime into the futures of the people whose survival his work was ostensibly designed to serve. He was also, beneath or alongside or inseparable from all of this, someone who had been given by his formation and his institution and the specific culture he moved within the complete set of conceptual tools required to design what he was about to design, the conceptual tools, and the specific absence of whatever quality would have made using them in this way feel like something other than a reasonable application of his professional capabilities to a problem he found genuinely interesting. The bombs had not yet fallen, the vaults had not yet sealed, the simulation had not yet started, but Braun was already, in all the ways that mattered, the man he was going to be when all three of those things had happened, and the last remaining constraint on the full expression of his character had been removed by the simple fact of his complete isolation from a world that no longer existed. The old world built him carefully, systematically, with the patient thoroughness of an institution that knew exactly what it was producing and valued the product precisely because of what it was. The public never knew what the vaults really were. That was the greatest trick ever pulled by the old world. Not the power armor, not the nuclear arsenal, not the illusion that America was winning the resource wars. It was the lie that the vaults existed to save people. Because by the time the bombs finally fell, the men and women running the United States had already accepted something horrifying. They no longer believed civilization could be preserved through peace, diplomacy, or reform. They believed the only future humanity had left was one that could be engineered in laboratories after the world died. And that belief gave birth to the Societal Preservation Program. On paper, the name sounded noble, even hopeful. Citizens reading Vault-Tec advertisements imagined communities surviving underground until the radiation faded, families protected beneath steel and concrete, teachers educating children inside safe shelters while the wasteland above slowly healed. The entire marketing campaign was built around comfort, smiling families, bright colors, patriotic slogans. The future was terrifying, but Vault-Tec promised continuity. America would survive underground, but buried underneath the advertisements and television commercials was a second purpose. Almost nobody outside the highest levels of government ever saw. The vaults were not designed merely to preserve life, they were designed to study it. Every vault became a controlled environment, a giant sealed laboratory filled with human subjects who never volunteered for the experiments taking place around them. Some vaults were built to study overcrowding. Others tested authoritarian rule, chemical exposure, social isolation, psychological conditioning, genetic mutation, weaponized addiction, or total deprivation of resources. Entire populations disappeared underground, believing they were being rescued, when in reality, they were being converted into test data for future generations that might never even exist. And among the scientists helping shape this nightmare, few embraced the philosophy more completely than Dr. Stanislaus Braun. Braun understood something that terrified the old world's leadership. Nuclear war would not simply destroy cities, it would destroy systems, governments, economies, cultural norms. Human behavior itself would change once civilization collapsed. The people emerging after the apocalypse might not even think like the people who entered the vaults. If humanity survived, it would evolve into something else entirely. To Braun, that transformation was not merely a tragedy, it was an opportunity. He became fascinated with the idea that human civilization could be rebuilt scientifically, controlled scientifically, directed scientifically. If enough data could be gathered before and after the war, perhaps future societies could be engineered into more stable forms, more obedient forms, more predictable forms. It was the dream of social engineering taken to its absolute extreme. And the horrifying part was that Braun was not alone. The pre-war United States had become obsessed with systems analysis, behavioral prediction, population management. Every institution increasingly viewed human beings as variables that could be measured, manipulated, and optimized. Corporations treated workers like interchangeable machine components. Military planners calculated acceptable civilian casualty ratios with mathematical precision. Politicians spoke about survival percentages rather than human suffering. By the final years before the Great War, morality itself was becoming statistical. Braun thrived in that environment. His intellect earned him enormous influence within scientific circles connected to Vault-Tec and the federal government. He was respected not because he was compassionate, but because he was effective. He approached psychological experimentation with a level of detachment that many others found disturbing but undeniably useful. He could look at horrifying ethical dilemmas without emotional hesitation. To men preparing for the possible extinction of the human race, that coldness became an asset, and slowly, Braun's ideas began influencing the philosophy behind the vaults themselves. Many scientists still believed the experiments had limits. They convinced themselves the suffering inside the vaults would eventually lead to discoveries capable of saving future generations. Temporary sacrifice for long-term survival. It was monstrous logic, but at least it maintained the illusion of altruism. Braun moved beyond that illusion entirely. He stopped viewing the vaults as shelters with experiments attached to them. He began viewing them purely as experiments. That distinction changed everything. In Braun's eyes, the residents were no longer citizens being protected. They were subjects inside behavioral ecosystems. Their emotions, fears, relationships, conflicts, and survival instincts all became valuable variables to manipulate. The vaults allowed scientists to isolate populations from the outside world completely. No external influences, no unpredictable cultural shifts, no interruptions. Human societies could now be observed under perfectly controlled conditions for decades, possibly centuries. And that possibility fascinated Braun more than nuclear survival itself, because the true dream of the societal preservation program was never simply keeping people alive underground. It was preserving civilization in a form that could be dissected. The experiments were designed to answer terrifying questions. What happens when people are denied privacy for generations? What happens when leadership becomes tyrannical? What happens when religion is manipulated artificially? What happens when addiction becomes institutionalized? What happens when fear becomes the foundation of social order? How long before morality collapses? How long before violence becomes normalized? How long before people stop remembering freedom ever existed? The vaults transformed humanity into data, and every answer came at the expense of real human lives. What made Braun especially dangerous was that he genuinely believed this was necessary. He believed civilization itself had failed because human beings were irrational, emotional, tribal, and violent. The old world had consumed itself through greed and nationalism until atomic fire erased entire continents. To Braun, that proved ordinary society could not be trusted to govern itself. Humanity needed guidance, correction, control. That belief pushed him toward increasingly radical theories regarding artificial environments and behavioral conditioning. If society naturally decayed into chaos, perhaps reality itself needed to be controlled. Perhaps populations needed to exist within engineered systems where every variable could be monitored and adjusted. Not governments, not democracies, experiments. That line of thinking eventually helped shape one of the most disturbing projects ever conceived by Vault Tech, Vault 112. But before Braun built his artificial paradise, another project emerged that represented the exact opposite philosophy, the Garden of Eden creation kit. Unlike most Vault Tech technologies, the GEC was built around genuine hope. It was one of the few projects from the old world that still carried traces of humanity's better instincts. While governments prepared for annihilation and corporations designed social experiments, the GEC represented the possibility that civilization might someday recover. The concept was simple in theory but revolutionary in execution. A portable system capable of helping survivors rebuild life after nuclear devastation. The GEC contained advanced construction tools, seed banks, environmental systems, industrial schematics, water purification technology, and enough resources to establish functioning settlements in hostile environments. Entire communities could potentially be rebuilt using a single unit. In the hands of capable survivors, the GEC could transform wasteland into farmland, ruins into towns, despair into stability. To many scientists, it symbolized redemption, a second chance for humanity. But even the GEC carried traces of the old world's contradictions. Because while one branch of pre-war America developed tools meant to restore civilization, another branch designed vault experiments meant to dissect it. The same society capable of creating life-saving technology also engineered systems of unimaginable cruelty. Fallout's world was never divided cleanly between heroes and villains. The same institutions responsible for humanity's salvation were often responsible for its suffering, and Stanislaus Braun existed directly in the center of that contradiction. Braun understood the value of the Gek, but not emotionally. He did not see it as a symbol of rebirth. He saw it as infrastructure. Another system, another tool capable of shaping human development after the war. Even hope itself became mechanized under his worldview. That was what made Braun fundamentally different from scientists who still retained some connection to empathy. Others looked at the wasteland and imagined rebuilding civilization. Braun looked at the wasteland and imagined redesigning civilization. The distinction sounds subtle. It was not. Rebuilding implied respect for human freedom, communities deciding their own futures, survivors reclaiming autonomy after catastrophe. Redesigning implied control, and Braun's obsession with control only intensified as the Great War approached. The closer humanity moved toward nuclear annihilation, the more extreme scientific projects became. Ethical boundaries collapsed almost entirely beneath the pressure of impending extinction. Funding flowed toward anything promising survival or strategic advantage. Virtual reality research accelerated rapidly. Neurological interface systems became increasingly advanced. Scientists explored ways to preserve consciousness, independent of traditional human limitations. Most of these technologies were intended for military applications or long-term survival research. Braun saw something else in them. He saw eternity. The concept of a fully immersive artificial environment fascinated him because it solved the greatest limitation of traditional social experiments: time. Human lives were finite. Civilizations evolved slowly. Researchers died before seeing long-term results. But what if human minds could exist indefinitely inside controlled digital environments? What if populations could be observed forever? What if reality itself became programmable? Those questions eventually became the foundation for Vault 112. Unlike many other vaults focused on broad sociological experiments, Vault 112 was intensely personal. It reflected Braun's individual philosophy more directly than almost any other vault tech project. The vault was not merely a shelter, it was a machine designed to grant one man near total authority over reality itself. Its physical structure was surprisingly small compared to other vaults. The true scale of the project existed inside the simulation network, hidden beneath the vault's metal walls. Residents would physically remain inside specialized lounges, while their consciousness entered an artificial suburban environment called Tranquility Lane. At first glance, the simulation appeared idyllic. Perfect little houses lined spotless streets beneath blue skies and white picket fences. Lawns remained neatly trimmed forever. Children played safely outdoors. Music drifted softly through the neighborhood. It resembled an exaggerated vision of mid-century American suburbia, preserved permanently inside a digital dream. But the perfection was unsettling. Too clean, too quiet, too artificial. And that discomfort was intentional. Braun deliberately chose the suburban aesthetic because it represented the old world's fantasy of stability. Before the bombs, American culture constantly promoted the image of suburban life as the ultimate achievement. Safe neighborhoods, happy families, predictable routines, controlled environments, isolated from the chaos of the outside world. Tranquility Lane weaponized that fantasy. The simulation trapped its residents inside an eternal performance of normalcy, while Braun manipulated every aspect of their existence behind the scenes. Their bodies remained helpless inside life support lounges, while their minds wandered endlessly through fabricated streets. The residents could feel pain, fear, joy, humiliation, and grief, exactly as if the simulation were real. To them, it was real, and Braun became its god. The technology itself was astonishingly advanced, even by pre-war standards. Neural interfaces translated sensory input directly into the brain. Residents experienced the simulation continuously, without aging normally inside the virtual environment. Death inside the simulation could be reversed. Memories could potentially be altered or erased. Reality itself became fluid beneath Braun's control. That level of authority transformed Vault 112 from a scientific experiment into something much darker, a kingdom. Unlike traditional dictators, Braun did not merely control laws or resources, he controlled existence itself. He could reshape environments instantly, inflict suffering at will, rewrite identities, remove escape entirely. The residents had nowhere to run because the world around them literally belonged to him. And perhaps most horrifying of all, Braun understood exactly what he was doing. He knew the simulation blurred the line between preservation and imprisonment. He knew eternal life inside artificial reality could become psychological torture. He knew isolation from authentic human existence would eventually erode sanity. But those dangers only increased his fascination. Because Vault 112 represented the ultimate realization of his beliefs, society reduced to controllable variables inside a perfectly engineered environment. Human beings preserved indefinitely for observation. Reality transformed into an experiment with no natural conclusion. The old world believed it was building shelters against nuclear annihilation. Braun was building something far more ambitious, a civilization that could never escape him. October 23rd, 2077 began like every other morning in America. Coffee makers hummed inside suburban kitchens. Radios crackled with cheerful music between emergency broadcasts. Children prepared for school while televisions spoke calmly about escalating tensions overseas. Cars filled the highways. Workers reported to factories. Soldiers stood watch at military checkpoints already exhausted from years of conflict and paranoia. And somewhere beneath the earth, Dr. Stanislaus Braun waited inside Vault 112. For years, the possibility of nuclear war had hung over the country like a storm cloud that never moved. Americans had grown used to the fear. That was one of the cruelest aspects of the Fallout universe. Humanity adapted to impending apocalypse the same way people adapt to bad weather. The end of civilization stopped feeling shocking because it had been discussed for so long. Emergency drills became routine. Vault registrations became normalized. Propaganda filled every screen until fear itself became part of ordinary life. Most citizens still believed the government would somehow prevent the worst outcome. Braun did not. Men like Braun understood that the old world was already dying long before the missiles launched. The resource wars had gutted nations. Political systems were collapsing beneath corruption and militarization. Entire economies revolved around scarcity, conflict, and technological escalation. America continued pretending it was stable because admitting otherwise would trigger panic. But underneath the illusion, the world was rotting. Braun saw nuclear war less as a possibility and more as an inevitability. And unlike most people, he was prepared for what came after. When the sirens finally sounded, civilization effectively ended in minutes. Missiles crossed oceans faster than governments could react. Entire cities disappeared beneath atomic fire before many citizens even understood what was happening. Communication networks collapsed almost instantly. Military defenses failed catastrophically. The world that humanity had spent thousands of years building burned itself to ash in less than 2 hours. But inside Vault 112, the apocalypse arrived differently, not through fire, through silence. The residents entering the vault believed they were survivors. Frightened, confused, desperate survivors carrying the last fragments of their old lives underground. Families clung together while security systems sealed behind them. Some cried, some prayed, others simply stared blankly, unable to process the scale of what had just happened above the surface. They thought the worst part was over. That belief did not survive long. Unlike conventional vaults, where residents physically lived inside underground communities. Vault 112 immediately directed occupants toward the neural simulation lounges. Most complied because they trusted the authority surrounding them. Vault-Tec employees spoke calmly. Instructions sounded organized. The technology itself appeared sophisticated and reassuring. The residents were told the simulation environment would help reduce stress while preserving long-term mental stability. The language was carefully chosen. Nobody said imprisonment. Nobody said experiment. Nobody said eternal captivity. The lounges closed around them one by one, and the moment their consciousness entered Tranquility Lane, Dr. Braun gained complete control. At first, many residents probably believed the simulation was temporary, a psychological adaptation period before normal vault life began. The environment itself reinforced that assumption. Bright suburban homes, green lawns, gentle music, familiar routines. It looked less like a survival shelter and more like a nostalgic memory of pre-war America. But slowly, the inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. The streets never changed. The sky never darkened naturally. The routines repeated endlessly. And most disturbing of all, there was no exit. Every road curved back into the neighborhood. Every attempt to escape failed. Questions about the outside world were ignored or redirected. The residents realized they were not merely living underground. They were trapped inside someone else's reality. And somewhere within that reality, Braun watched everything. The bombs changed Braun as completely as they changed the planet itself. Before the war, he had still existed within systems larger than himself. Governments, corporations, scientific institutions. Even with enormous authority, limits still existed. Ethical committees could interfere. Funding agencies could apply pressure. Political leaders could override projects. Society itself imposed barriers, however weak they had become. On October 23rd, those barriers vanished forever. The old world died, and with it died every remaining restraint on Stanislaus Braun. That transformation did not happen instantly. True madness rarely arrives all at once. It grows slowly inside isolation, power, and unchecked desire. In the early years after the war, Braun likely still viewed himself as a scientist, overseeing an important long-term experiment. He probably justified the residents' confinement as necessary for research, necessary for preservation, necessary for understanding how humanity adapted to catastrophe. But time changes people, especially when consequences disappear. Inside Vault 112, Braun effectively became immortal. The neural systems preserved both his body and consciousness far beyond normal human limitations. While the wasteland above descended into radiation, mutation, famine, and violence, Braun remained sealed inside his artificial paradise, where aging slowed and death lost meaning. That kind of existence destroys perspective. Human morality is deeply tied to limitation. People understand empathy partly because they suffer. They understand mortality because they fear death. They understand restraint because they know actions carry consequences. Braun slowly lost all three. Years turned into decades. Decades turned into centuries. And the residents remained trapped beside him the entire time. The horrifying thing about immortality and fallout is that it almost never brings wisdom. It magnifies whatever already exists inside a person. Compassionate people may become weary. Violent people become monstrous. Obsessed people lose themselves completely. Braun's obsession was control, and inside Tranquility Lane, control became limitless. He could alter appearances instantly, manipulate environments effortlessly, inflict pain or pleasure with a thought. The simulation allowed him to shape reality itself according to his whims. Over time, the line between experimentation and entertainment disappeared entirely. The residents stopped being research subjects. They became toys. That was the true corruption of Vault 112. Not merely technological imprisonment, but the complete collapse of human relationships into domination. Braun no longer saw the residents as equals, because centuries of absolute power erased his ability to relate to ordinary humanity. And then came Betty. Of all the disturbing decisions Braun ever made, choosing the avatar of a little girl might be the most revealing. On the surface, Betty appeared harmless. A cheerful child wandering perfect suburban streets with an unsettling smile and soft voice. But beneath that appearance existed one of the oldest and cruelest minds remaining in the wasteland. The choice was deliberate. Braun understood the psychological discomfort created by innocence, masking authority. Adults naturally underestimate children. They expect vulnerability, dependence, harmlessness. Betty weaponized those assumptions. Residents trapped inside the simulation were forced to obey commands delivered by a smiling little girl who spoke with casual cruelty while controlling every aspect of their existence. It transformed ordinary interactions into something deeply uncanny. Betty could giggle while threatening torture. She could smile while erasing memories. She could speak like a playful child while sentencing people to endless suffering. The contrast amplified the horror, but the avatar also revealed something deeper about Braun himself. After centuries inside the simulation, Braun no longer wanted merely to rule. He wanted emotional reactions: fear, confusion, submission. The childish appearance allowed him to humiliate the residents more effectively because it inverted every normal social expectation. Parents were forced to obey a child. Adults begged for mercy from someone wearing the face of innocence. It turned authority itself into psychological torture, and the torment never truly stopped. One of the cruelest aspects of Vault 112 was the residents' inability to escape through death. Braun could kill them inside the simulation repeatedly, but the neural systems simply restored their consciousness afterward. Murder became temporary, suffering became renewable. That changed the entire nature of punishment. In the real world, death represents an ending. Inside Tranquility Lane, there was no ending. Residents could be humiliated, mutilated, psychologically broken, or murdered endlessly while remaining trapped inside the system afterward. Braun created an environment where consequences existed for the victims, but not for himself. Over 2 centuries, the residents endured countless cycles of manipulation. Braun forced them into degrading role-playing scenarios. He altered their appearances, erased memories, created conflicts between neighbors purely for amusement. Sometimes, he rewarded obedience temporarily before suddenly reversing himself. The unpredictability became part of the torture because nobody inside the simulation could ever feel secure. Even happiness became dangerous. Any moment of comfort could instantly transform into horror if Braun grew bored. And boredom became one of the defining forces of his existence. That was the paradox at the center of Braun's godhood. Absolute power did not satisfy him forever. Eventually, limitless control became ordinary, predictable, empty. The residents suffered because Braun needed stimulation after centuries trapped inside his own experiment. He had transformed himself into something profoundly pathetic. An immortal genius capable of rewriting reality, spending eternity terrorizing helpless minds because he no longer knew how to feel anything else. The suburban setting of Tranquility Lane made the horror even worse. Everything remained wrapped in nostalgic Americana: white fences, birthday parties, friendly greetings, pleasant music drifting through clean streets untouched by radiation. It was a parody of the old world's dream of safety, and every resident understood the nightmare hiding underneath it. Imagine waking up every morning, knowing a godlike intelligence was watching your thoughts. Knowing reality itself could change without warning. Knowing your memories might not even belong entirely to you anymore. Knowing death would not free you. Knowing centuries might pass without escape. That was life inside Vault 112. And over time, the residents changed. Some became submissive, hoping obedience might reduce Braun's cruelty. Others became paranoid and unstable. Human relationships deteriorated because nobody could fully trust each other inside an environment controlled completely by manipulation. The simulation poisoned normal social behavior. Fear infected every interaction because Braun could exploit any weakness instantly. Children never grew naturally. Adults lost track of time. Identity itself began eroding. The residents existed in a kind of psychological suspension where authentic human development became impossible. They were preserved physically, but spiritually hollowed out year after year beneath Braun's control. And perhaps the most horrifying part was that Braun considered all of this valuable. To him, these centuries represented data, proof of his theories regarding human adaptability, dependency, fear, and control. He interpreted the residents' suffering as evidence supporting his worldview rather than condemning it. That was the final stage of his transformation. Braun no longer recognized cruelty as cruelty. Power had rewritten his morality completely. Inside Tranquility Lane, he genuinely became convinced of his own superiority. After all, he controlled reality while the residents remained helpless beneath him. He observed every emotional breakdown, every betrayal, every desperate attempt at resistance, eventually crushed beneath the simulation's systems. To Braun, these failures confirmed that ordinary humans were weak and irrational. Only he remained above them. Only he understood the system. Only he deserved control. It was the classic evolution of a god complex, taken to its absolute extreme. And yet beneath all the power, something deeply tragic existed inside Braun's existence. Because despite centuries of domination, despite immortality, despite technological supremacy, Braun never truly escaped his own prison. Vault 112 trapped him too. At first glance, that sounds absurd. Braun controlled the simulation. He could alter environments, manipulate minds, and reshape reality itself. How could someone so powerful possibly be trapped? Because power without purpose eventually becomes meaningless. Braun spent over 200 years repeating variations of the same games inside the same artificial neighborhood. He could torment residents endlessly, but nothing genuinely changed. The outside world moved forward without him. Entire civilizations rose and fell across the wasteland while Braun remained buried underground, replaying psychological experiments inside fake suburbia. His godhood became stagnant, empty, circular. The simulation that granted him absolute authority also isolated him completely from authentic existence. Every interaction became artificial because nobody inside Tranquility Lane could ever engage with him honestly. They feared him too much, hated him too deeply. Even obedience carried resentment underneath it. Braun had achieved total control at the cost of every real human connection, and somewhere over those centuries, he stopped noticing the difference. That was the true horror of Stanislaus Braun, not simply that he became cruel, but that he became incapable of understanding why cruelty mattered at all. Braun's transformation into Betty did more than create fear. It fundamentally distorted the psychology of everyone trapped inside Tranquility Lane. Human beings rely on patterns to feel stable. Adults instinctively understand social hierarchies. Parents protect children. Teachers guide students. Elders carry authority. Entire civilizations are built upon these invisible expectations that help people navigate reality without constantly questioning it. Braun shattered those expectations deliberately. Every conversation with Betty forced the residents into emotional confusion. The face standing before them belonged to a child, but the mind behind it possessed centuries of intelligence and cruelty. The voice sounded playful one moment and terrifying the next. Sometimes Betty behaved sweetly, almost affectionately. Other times she issued horrifying commands with casual amusement. That unpredictability became psychological warfare. The residents could never emotionally prepare themselves because Braun constantly shifted tones and behaviors. A smiling greeting might suddenly become a threat. A harmless conversation might transform into humiliation in seconds. Even silence became frightening because nobody knew what mood Braun would wake up in next. And after decades of this treatment, the residents stopped behaving like ordinary people entirely. Fear reshaped them. Some residents became desperate to entertain Braun because entertainment often delayed punishment. They laughed at jokes that terrified them. They played along with absurd suburban routines because resistance usually made things worse. Entire personalities were gradually reconstructed around survival inside the simulation. Others collapsed inward completely. Isolation inside artificial reality erodes the human mind in ways difficult to fully comprehend. The residents no longer had meaningful futures to imagine. They could not grow old naturally. They could not escape physically. They could not build genuine societies because Braun interfered constantly whenever stability emerged. Existence became static, every day repeated endlessly beneath artificial skies. And that repetition slowly consumed people. One of the most horrifying details about Tranquility Lane is how normal it looked from the outside. If someone wandered briefly through the neighborhood without understanding the truth, it might even appear peaceful. Children played outside, neighbors spoke politely, houses remained beautiful and untouched by decay. But beneath that surface, every resident existed under constant psychological occupation. No private thoughts, no real freedom, no permanence. The neighborhood itself functioned like a stage set designed to imitate human happiness without ever truly allowing it to exist. Braun understood that terror becomes more effective when surrounded by normality. Violence inside an obvious nightmare eventually loses emotional impact because victims expect horror. But cruelty hidden beneath cheerful suburbia creates permanent unease. Everything feels wrong even before the suffering begins. That atmosphere became one of Vault 112's greatest achievements and greatest horrors. Braun did not create a wasteland simulation filled with monsters and destruction. He created paradise corrupted from within. And over time, even Braun himself became infected by the artificiality surrounding him. That is something many people overlook about his character. Braun's cruelty was real, but so was his deterioration. Human consciousness was never designed to exist for centuries inside a fabricated environment divorced from natural reality. Even with all his power, Braun gradually lost pieces of himself inside the simulation. His emotional responses became warped. His sense of time collapsed. His understanding of consequence vanished completely. When ordinary humans hurt someone, reality pushes back. Victims suffer visibly. Society condemns violence. Physical danger exists. But Braun existed beyond all of those limitations. The simulation insulated him from consequence so thoroughly that morality itself began dissolving inside his mind. Eventually, he stopped seeing residents as people altogether. They became functions, characters, interactive objects inside his world. That dehumanization allowed him to commit acts that would have horrified even many Vault-Tec scientists before the war. Braun could erase memories casually because he no longer considered identity sacred. He could manipulate relationships because emotional bonds seemed insignificant compared to his authority. He could murder residents repeatedly because death inside the simulation lost permanence. The residents became infinitely reusable, and immortality transformed suffering into routine. Imagine enduring 2 centuries where even your emotional breakdowns become entertainment for someone else. Imagine realizing that your tormentor cannot grow tired, cannot age normally, and cannot be reasoned with because he controls the laws of reality itself. Over time, hopelessness would become unavoidable. That hopelessness permeated Tranquility Lane. Even the environment reflected it subtly. The same songs played endlessly. The same roads curved endlessly. The same houses stood frozen in artificial perfection, while the residents mentally decayed inside them. There were no seasons, no authentic change, no future, only repetition. That repetition mattered because it symbolized the death of human progress itself. Civilization normally evolves through struggle, discovery, and adaptation. Communities grow because time moves forward. But inside Vault 112, time became meaningless. Braun had preserved the residents physically while trapping them psychologically in permanent stagnation. It was preservation twisted into imprisonment. And somewhere inside that stagnation, Braun's god complex expanded until it consumed nearly everything human left within him. The terrifying thing about absolute power is how quickly it rewrites perception. Braun did not wake up one morning believing himself divine. The transformation happened gradually through endless reinforcement. Every command obeyed, every resident broken, every environment altered at his whim, strengthened the illusion that he existed above ordinary humanity. After 2 centuries, how could he not believe it? He controlled weather, memory, pain, appearance, death itself. From Braun's perspective, the residents probably seemed almost primitive compared to him. They remained trapped inside emotional reactions while he reshaped reality effortlessly. Their fear likely amused him because fear proved his superiority. Their suffering confirmed his authority. And because nobody inside the vault could challenge him meaningfully, those beliefs hardened unchecked. That is the danger of isolated power in Fallout. Again and again throughout the series, individuals or organizations gain enough technological superiority that they stop viewing themselves as part of humanity. The Master believed mutation would perfect mankind. The Enclave believed genetic purity justified extermination. Caesar believed civilization required absolute authoritarianism. Braun believed humanity existed to be controlled. Each villain reflects a different version of the same old-world disease, the conviction that intelligence or power grants moral superiority. But Braun's version feels uniquely disturbing because it is so personal. He did not seek empires. He did not seek armies. He did not even seek survival on a global scale anymore. He wanted dominion over individual human beings. Intimate domination, psychological ownership, that made Vault 112 feel less like a scientific facility and more like an eternal, abusive relationship scaled up into an entire society. Braun manipulated emotions the same way dictators manipulate populations, except he operated at a microscopic level inside people's daily lives. Every interaction became vulnerable to his interference. And because the residents could not escape, they eventually adapted around the abuse itself. That adaptation may be the saddest part of the entire vault. Human beings can normalize almost anything if trapped inside it long enough. Over generations, terror becomes routine. People develop coping mechanisms. Small moments of relief begin feeling precious simply because suffering is constant. Inside Tranquility Lane, survival no longer meant freedom or happiness. It meant enduring one more day without attracting Braun's attention. That reduction of human existence into pure endurance perfectly captured the moral collapse of the old world. Vault 112 began as an experiment, supposedly connected to preservation, stability, and scientific advancement. But stripped of propaganda and technical language, the vault ultimately became a monument to selfishness. Braun preserved people only so he could own them forever. And despite all his intelligence, despite all his technological mastery, despite centuries of experimentation, he never truly created anything meaningful. No thriving civilization emerged from Tranquility Lane. No scientific enlightenment transformed humanity. No utopia developed beneath his guidance. Only suffering repeated endlessly beneath artificial sunlight. That is why Braun remains one of the most disturbing figures in Fallout lore. Many villains destroy lives through rage, ideology, or desperation. Braun destroyed lives through boredom, through entitlement, through the casual assumption that other human beings existed for his amusement. And somewhere above Vault 112, the wasteland kept moving without him. Empires rose across the ruins of America. Raiders carved out territories. Super mutants wandered irradiated highways. Brotherhood Knights searched ancient military bunkers. Settlements struggled to rebuild civilization from ash and rust. Real human history continued. But Braun remained buried underground inside his fake neighborhood, replaying the same sadistic games for century after century after century. The apocalypse had ended the world. Vault 112 ensured Stanislaus Braun would never truly leave it behind. There were likely moments, deep into those centuries, where the residents of Tranquility Lane began forgetting pieces of the real world entirely. Not because Braun erased every memory directly, though he certainly had the power to manipulate minds whenever he wished, but because memory itself deteriorates when trapped in repetition. Human beings are not meant to exist in static environments forever. The brain organizes life through change. Seasons pass, cities evolve, people age, history moves forward. Those changes anchor memory to reality. Tranquility Lane had none of that. The same houses stood forever. The same roads curved endlessly beneath the same artificial sky. Even the sunlight felt wrong, because it never carried the subtle imperfections of the real world. No shifting weather patterns, no authentic cold, no genuine silence. Everything inside the simulation existed as an imitation of life, carefully maintained by machines. And over time, that artificiality began infecting the residents themselves. Some probably struggled desperately to remember details from before the war. The smell of rain in an actual city, the sound of traffic beyond suburban streets, the texture of authentic human freedom. But after decades trapped inside Braun's system, those memories would blur together like dreams. That was another layer of the horror. Braun was not merely controlling bodies. He was slowly replacing reality itself. For many residents, Tranquility Lane eventually became the only world they could still fully comprehend. The old world faded into abstraction, while the simulation remained immediate and unavoidable. Fear conditioned them to focus entirely on surviving the present moment, because thinking too much about the past only intensified despair. And Braun understood this process intimately. In fact, he likely encouraged it. The more disconnected the residents became from authentic memory, the easier they were to dominate. A prisoner who remembers freedom remains dangerous. A prisoner who forgets freedom becomes manageable. That idea sits at the core of nearly every authoritarian system in Fallout. Control is never just physical, it is psychological. The old world constantly manipulated information, patriotism, and fear to shape public perception before the bombs ever fell. Braun simply perfected that manipulation on an individual scale. Inside Vault 112, he controlled not only what residents experienced, but eventually what they believed reality itself was supposed to feel like. That level of power is difficult to even conceptualize. Imagine a human mind isolated inside artificial existence for over 200 years. Every relationship mediated by one controlling intelligence, every environment programmable, every attempt at rebellion crushed through technological superiority. Eventually, the boundaries between authentic selfhood and imposed identity begin collapsing. People stop asking how to escape. They start asking how to survive emotionally inside the cage. And Braun watched that transformation happen in real time. That was the part he truly enjoyed. Not merely pain, but adaptation. Braun wanted to observe how long people could endure hopelessness before it fundamentally changed them. He wanted to see how identities fractured beneath total surveillance and manipulation. Every emotional collapse inside Tranquility Lane became proof, supporting his worldview that human beings were weak, malleable creatures, incapable of genuine autonomy. But there was profound hypocrisy buried inside that belief. Because Braun himself had become just as dependent on the simulation as the residents. In many ways, he was the weakest person inside the vault. The residents at least remembered suffering. They understood imprisonment because they experienced it directly every moment of their existence. Braun, meanwhile, spent centuries insulating himself from vulnerability. He controlled every interaction because authentic unpredictability terrified him. Real human relationships require compromise, empathy, uncertainty, and emotional risk. Braun abandoned all of those things. He preferred domination because domination guaranteed safety. Inside Tranquility Lane, nobody could reject him meaningfully. Nobody could challenge him physically. Nobody could truly leave him. His godhood eliminated the possibility of vulnerability altogether. And that reveals something deeply pathetic at the center of his character. For all his intelligence, Braun could not handle ordinary humanity. He retreated into artificial perfection because real life was uncontrollable. That is why Tranquility Lane resembles an exaggerated suburban fantasy rather than some abstract scientific environment. Braun did not merely want a laboratory, he wanted comfort, familiarity, predictability. The fake neighborhood reflected his desire to freeze reality into a manageable shape where nothing could evolve beyond his authority. It was nostalgia weaponized into tyranny. The old world had sold suburbia as humanity's ideal future. Safe homes, clean streets, structured routines, everything controlled and orderly. But Fallout constantly exposes the darkness hidden beneath that image. Beneath the smiling advertisements and patriotic slogans existed paranoia, conformity, militarization, and emotional emptiness. Tranquility Lane amplified those themes until they became monstrous. Every smiling face concealed terror. Every pleasant conversation hid desperation. Every cheerful house functioned as part of a prison system. And at the center stood Braun, wearing the face of a child while orchestrating endless cycles of psychological cruelty. The symbolism becomes even more disturbing when considering what Betty represented culturally. Children are supposed to embody innocence and future potential. They symbolize hope, continuity, and emotional purity. Braun corrupted that symbolism completely. Betty became innocence stripped of empathy, childhood stripped of vulnerability, a smiling mask hiding absolute power. The residents could never emotionally reconcile what they were seeing, and that dissonance kept them unstable. One can imagine how daily life inside the simulation slowly transformed into ritualized fear. Residents likely developed habits meant to avoid provoking Braun. Certain phrases became dangerous. Certain behaviors attracted punishment. Social interactions grew cautious because anyone might accidentally trigger one of Braun's games. Even joy became risky. That is something survivors of abusive systems often describe in both fiction and reality. Happiness begins feeling suspicious because it never lasts. Moments of comfort become frightening because experience teaches that suffering usually follows immediately afterward. Tranquility Lane probably operated exactly that way. A peaceful afternoon could suddenly become a nightmare simply because Braun decided he was bored, and boredom remained one of the most important forces driving his cruelty. People often assume evil must emerge from grand ideology or intense hatred. Braun proves something far more unsettling. Sometimes cruelty emerges from emptiness. After 200 years without meaningful challenge, achievement, or emotional growth, Braun's existence hollowed out completely. The simulation removed every natural struggle from his life except one: finding stimulation. The residents suffered because Braun needed distractions from eternity. That transforms Vault 112 into one of the bleakest commentaries in Fallout lore about immortality itself. Humanity often fantasizes about eternal life, but Fallout repeatedly asks what happens when immortality exists without moral growth. Again and again, characters who live too long become detached from ordinary human experience. They lose urgency, empathy weakens, time erodes emotional connection. Braun became immortal before he became wise, and that combination was catastrophic. Centuries passed while his emotional maturity effectively froze. Intellectually, he remained brilliant. Technologically, he remained godlike within the simulation. But spiritually and morally, he decayed. Instead of growing beyond cruelty, he normalized it. Instead of seeking meaning, he retreated further into manipulation and control. He became smaller as his power increased. That contradiction defines him perfectly. Braun possessed one of the most advanced technological systems ever created by Vault-Tec, yet he used it to torment helpless suburban captives forever. He gained near-divine authority over reality, yet spent eternity playing childish psychological games because he could not imagine anything more meaningful to do with his existence. Even the residents probably recognized this eventually, and perhaps that realization made the situation even worse. Because if Braun had been purely monstrous, hatred would have remained simple. But seeing glimpses of his emptiness beneath the cruelty likely created another layer of despair. The residents were trapped forever beneath the authority of someone profoundly broken, someone intelligent enough to understand suffering intellectually, but too emotionally hollow to care anymore. That is why Braun feels terrifying in a uniquely realistic way. He does not rant about conquest. He does not dream about saving humanity. He does not even pretend to possess noble intentions anymore. He simply exercises power because he enjoys having it. And history is filled with people exactly like that. The bombs may have destroyed the old world physically, but figures like Braun prove its moral sickness survived underground. Vault 112 became a concentrated version of everything wrong with pre-war civilization. Technological arrogance, dehumanization, obsession with control, and the belief that intelligence justified domination over others. The simulation preserved those flaws perfectly. In a twisted way, Braun succeeded at societal preservation after all. He preserved the worst parts of humanity indefinitely. More than 200 years after the Great War, someone finally entered Vault 112 who did not belong there. That mattered more than Braun initially realized. For centuries, Tranquility Lane existed as a closed system. The same residents, the same routines, the same trapped minds, endlessly circling through Braun's artificial suburbia. Nothing truly unpredictable entered the simulation anymore. Even suffering became repetitive after enough time. Braun controlled every variable so completely that existence itself lost spontaneity. Then the lone wanderer arrived, and suddenly, for the first time in generations, something new appeared inside Braun's world. The journey leading to Vault 112 already carried enormous emotional weight. The lone wanderer was not searching for treasure, conquest, or scientific discovery. They were searching for their father, James. In the brutal landscape of the capital wasteland, that mission carried rare emotional sincerity. Fallout's world is filled with survivors, hardened by violence and desperation. Yet the central drive behind the lone wanderer's story remained deeply human. Family, connection, hope. Those values stood in direct opposition to everything Braun had become. James himself represented another fascinating contrast to Braun. Both men were scientists, shaped by the ruins of the old world, but they reached entirely different conclusions about humanity. James dedicated himself to Project Purity, attempting to provide clean water to the wasteland and improve lives despite overwhelming hardship. Braun devoted himself to control, manipulation, and psychological domination. Both possessed intelligence. Only one retained empathy. When James entered Vault 112 seeking Braun's assistance for Project Purity, he walked willingly into one of the worst nightmares remaining beneath the wasteland. It is likely James understood Braun's reputation at least partially before arriving, but desperation changes people. Project Purity required advanced scientific knowledge and resources beyond ordinary wasteland capabilities, and Braun still possessed both. The tragedy was that James underestimated just how far Braun had deteriorated over 2 centuries. Once James entered the simulation, he immediately recognized the danger surrounding Tranquility Lane. Unlike the original residents, he had experienced the real wasteland firsthand. He understood genuine freedom because he still remembered living outside artificial systems. That perspective made Braun's control intolerable almost instantly. James resisted, and resistance inside Vault 112 always carried consequences. By the time the lone wanderer finally tracked him to the vault, James had already become trapped within Braun's game. The neural lounges sealed the connection. Escape became nearly impossible without Braun's cooperation. The lone wanderer's arrival therefore disrupted something Braun had not experienced in centuries: uncertainty. The moment the player enters Tranquility Lane in Fallout 3, the atmosphere feels wrong immediately. Not openly terrifying at first, quietly terrifying. The neighborhood appears too perfect. The streets feel too empty. Every smile carries unnatural tension beneath it. The music drifting through the environment sounds cheerful in a way that becomes unsettling rather than comforting. Even players unfamiliar with the deeper lore instinctively sense that something inside Tranquility Lane is deeply corrupted. That atmosphere reflects Braun perfectly. Evil rarely presents itself honestly inside Fallout. The wasteland's greatest horrors often hide beneath idealism, patriotism, or technological optimism. Vault 112 continues that tradition by disguising psychological torture beneath nostalgic suburban imagery. And then Betty appears. For the lone wanderer, encountering Betty must feel profoundly disorienting. A little girl approaches calmly inside this eerie artificial suburb, speaking casually while subtly revealing impossible authority over the environment itself. Players quickly realize the child is not really a child at all. She is Dr. Braun. Even after centuries, Braun immediately falls back into the same behavioral patterns that defined his existence inside the vault. He toys with the lone wanderer rather than speaking honestly. He withholds information because manipulation entertains him. Most importantly, he tests the newcomer psychologically before offering any assistance. That need for games reveals everything about his mental state. Braun no longer knows how to interact with people normally. Every relationship must involve control. Every conversation becomes performance. Every encounter transforms into a test of dominance. The lone wanderer's presence excites Braun precisely because it interrupts the monotony consuming his immortal existence. Here stands someone new, someone not yet fully conditioned by Tranquility Lane, someone capable of resisting emotionally in ways the long-broken residents no longer can. To Braun, the lone wanderer becomes entertainment immediately, and so the games begin. Braun forces the player into a series of disturbing tasks throughout the simulation, each designed to humiliate, manipulate, or psychologically corrupt both the wanderer and the trapped residents around them. The player can terrorize neighbors, orchestrate suffering, and participate directly in Braun's cruelty in exchange for cooperation. That choice matters thematically because it reflects one of Fallout's central questions. How much of your humanity survives when power makes cruelty easy? Braun constantly attempts to normalize evil through absurdity and playfulness. The tasks inside Tranquility Lane often feel bizarrely childish on the surface, but underneath them lies genuine psychological violence. This combination perfectly mirrors Braun's mindset after centuries as Betty. He no longer distinguishes clearly between games and suffering, because the simulation blurred those boundaries long ago. To him, torment became entertainment, and entertainment became routine. What makes these sequences especially disturbing is how casually Braun presents them. He does not scream or threaten dramatically. He speaks with relaxed confidence because he assumes his authority is absolute. The residents have obeyed him for centuries. Why would the lone wanderer be any different? But Braun miscalculates something crucial. The lone wanderer comes from the wasteland. Unlike the original Vault residents, who entered Tranquility Lane directly from pre-war civilization, the wanderer grew up surrounded by hardship, violence, and survival. The capital wasteland creates resilient people precisely because reality there is honest about its brutality. Raiders kill openly, super mutants attack openly. Hunger and radiation exist visibly. Braun's horror operates differently. It hides behind smiles, and perhaps because of that, it feels even more monstrous. The lone wanderer represents something Braun has not faced in generations, a person still capable of moral choice despite overwhelming pressure. Inside the simulation, the player can comply with Braun's demands or search for another solution entirely. That alternative solution exists because someone inside Vault-Tec eventually recognized how dangerous Braun might become. Hidden within the simulation lies a failsafe, unlike anything else inside Tranquility Lane. The Chinese invasion program. Even its name feels surreal inside the context of the simulation. A leftover piece of pre-war paranoia buried inside artificial suburbia. Yet the existence of the failsafe reveals an important truth about Vault 112. Somebody anticipated catastrophe. Whether Vault-Tec executives fully understood Braun's psychological instability is unclear, but they clearly recognized the possibility that total control over a virtual environment could become catastrophic in the wrong hands. The Chinese invasion program functioned as an emergency override capable of destabilizing the simulation itself, and more importantly, capable of freeing the residents from Braun permanently. The symbolism behind the failsafe is fascinating. Tranquility Lane represented the idealized fantasy of pre-war America: suburban comfort, order, nostalgia, controlled happiness. The Chinese invasion scenario represented America's greatest fear before the bombs fell: foreign destruction, communist infiltration, national collapse. The failsafe literally weaponizes pre-war paranoia against Braun's artificial paradise. Once activated, the illusion begins collapsing. Residents gain awareness. The system destabilizes. Braun loses control. For perhaps the first time in over 2 centuries, genuine fear enters his existence again. That moment is incredibly important because it exposes the fragility beneath Braun's God complex. For centuries, he presented himself as omnipotent inside Tranquility Lane, but the failsafe proves his authority was never truly absolute. Hidden beneath the system he worshipped existed the possibility of rebellion all along, and suddenly Braun becomes desperate. Not angry at first, desperate, because the destruction of the simulation threatens more than his power. It threatens his entire identity. Braun spent centuries merging himself psychologically with Tranquility Lane. The simulation became his kingdom, his laboratory, his home, and eventually his understanding of reality itself. Without it, what remains? An old man trapped underground, a scientist forgotten by history, a pathetic immortal hiding inside dead suburbia while the real world moved on without him. The Chinese invasion program therefore functions almost like divine judgment against Braun. The very technology he used to imprison others becomes vulnerable to collapse from within. The god of Tranquility Lane suddenly realizes he was never truly beyond consequence after all, and the residents finally glimpse escape. But even escape inside Vault 112 carries tragedy attached to it. After centuries inside the simulation, freedom becomes complicated. Many residents likely barely remember authentic reality anymore. Their minds adapted around artificial existence for generations. Releasing them from Braun does not magically restore the lives stolen from them. The psychological damage remains enormous. 200 years cannot simply be undone. That moral ambiguity makes the vault so haunting. Even the good ending feels bittersweet, because Braun already destroyed so much permanently. The residents survive, but survival after centuries of psychological imprisonment hardly resembles victory. And yet the possibility of choice still matters. That is the key distinction between Braun and the Lone Wanderer. Braun believes humanity exists to be controlled because he lost faith in individual freedom long ago. The Wanderer's actions inside the vault challenge that worldview directly. By rejecting Braun's authority and activating the failsafe, the player demonstrates something Braun stopped believing centuries earlier. People can still choose compassion, even in the wasteland, even after everything humanity has become. That rejection of Braun's philosophy echoes throughout Fallout's broader themes. Again and again, the series asks whether civilization deserves rebuilding after all the horrors humanity inflicted upon itself. Characters like Braun argue implicitly that people are too weak, selfish, or irrational for freedom. Control appears safer, more stable, more efficient, but Fallout consistently reveals the monstrous cost of that logic. Every attempt to perfect humanity through domination creates new nightmares instead. Vault 112 stands among the clearest examples of that lesson. Braun preserved life physically while annihilating dignity, autonomy, and meaning. His society survived technologically but died spiritually centuries earlier, and somewhere beneath all the horror lies an even sadder truth. Braun himself may have understood this eventually. Not consciously perhaps, not honestly, but somewhere beneath the cruelty and arrogance, there are hints of profound emptiness inside his character. After all, why continue tormenting the residents endlessly, if not because nothing else remained capable of making him feel alive? That emptiness becomes part of Braun's lasting legacy across Fallout lore. Unlike conquerors or revolutionaries, Braun leaves behind no empire, no ideology, no meaningful achievements benefiting humanity. His great accomplishment was the creation of a prison disguised as paradise, a technological miracle used for spiritual decay. And yet, he remains unforgettable precisely because he embodies so many of Fallout's deepest fears simultaneously. Fear of unchecked technology, fear of isolation, fear of immortality, fear of authority without accountability, fear of losing reality itself beneath systems designed by people who mistake intelligence for wisdom. Vault 112 distills all those anxieties into one nightmare hidden quietly beneath the wasteland. And perhaps most disturbing of all is the possibility that Braun never truly disappears. Depending on the player's choices, remnants of the simulation may continue operating. Braun's consciousness, merged so completely with Tranquility Lane over centuries, could potentially survive inside fragments of the system indefinitely. Even weakened, even defeated, the possibility remains that somewhere in the darkness, beneath ruined America, Betty still wanders those artificial streets, still smiling, still watching, still waiting for someone new to enter her neighborhood. That lingering uncertainty perfectly suits Fallout's world. The apocalypse did not neatly erase humanity's mistakes. It preserved many of them. Old systems continue running long after the civilizations that built them collapsed. Ancient experiments continue operating beneath ruined cities. Machines maintain routines nobody remembers creating. Vault 112 is one of the purest examples of that idea. A dead civilization created a digital god, then buried it underground and walked away. And for over 200 years, that god spent eternity replaying humanity's worst instincts beneath an artificial blue sky. More than 2 centuries after Vault 112 sealed itself beneath the ruins of America, the world above had already moved on in ways Braun never truly acknowledged. Civilization did not end. It fractured. It mutated. It rebuilt itself in broken pieces scattered across irradiated soil. And yet, beneath all of that chaos, something unexpected eventually reached the Vault's forgotten systems. A human being who still believed in something like truth. The lone wanderer was not supposed to matter in Braun's design. They were not part of any Vault experiment, not part of any controlled demographic sample, not a variable he had accounted for during the original construction of Tranquility Lane. To Braun, the outside world had long since become irrelevant background noise, a fading simulation of its own compared to the perfection of his internal domain. But irrelevance does not mean immunity, because even a god trapped in a closed system can be disturbed by something as simple as curiosity from the outside. The wanderer's arrival begins with something deceptively ordinary, a search for a missing parent. James, a scientist whose ideals stand in stark contrast to Braun's own philosophy, becomes the emotional anchor that drives the player deeper into the wasteland than most survivors would ever dare travel. In a world defined by scavenging and survival, that kind of motivation feels almost ancient, almost pre-war in its emotional clarity. Love, loss, purpose. Those things are rare in the capital wasteland, not because people cannot feel them, but because the world has spent centuries punishing anyone who holds on to them too tightly. James represents something Braun abandoned long ago. The belief that humanity can be guided without being owned, When the Wanderer finally traces James's path to Vault 112, they are not stepping into a normal vault. They are stepping into the fossilized remains of Braun's mind made physical, a structure that has not meaningfully changed in over 200 years, not because it is stable, but because nothing inside it is allowed to evolve. And evolution is the one thing Braun cannot tolerate. The first moments inside Tranquility Lane are deliberately disorienting. Everything appears too perfect, too balanced, too carefully arranged to feel real. The suburban environment is not just nostalgic, it is aggressively nostalgic. It insists on itself. It demands acceptance. The symmetry of the streets feels almost oppressive in its precision, as though reality has been ironed flat and forced into a shape that pleases no one except the mind controlling it. The player senses it immediately, even without context. Something is wrong here, not broken in an obvious way, but curated. That subtle difference is what makes Vault 112 so effective as a psychological construct. Braun did not build a nightmare of blood and fire. He built a nightmare of comfort, a place where horror is hidden under normality so completely that recognition itself becomes uncertain. Then Betty appears, a small child in a perfect suburban street, smiling, waiting, observing, and speaking with the calm authority of something that does not belong in a human hierarchy at all. At this point, the truth begins to surface, slowly, uncomfortably. The realization that this child is not a child at all, that the voice is too controlled, the behavior too deliberate, the knowledge too precise. The environment itself bends subtly around her presence in ways that no ordinary person could influence. The mask is thin, and behind it is Stanislaus Braun. What follows is not simply interaction, it is psychological testing disguised as gameplay. Braun does not communicate like someone asking for help. He communicates like someone evaluating a specimen. Every instruction becomes a measurement of obedience. Every task becomes a reflection of moral flexibility. Every choice becomes a way to map how far the Wanderer is willing to bend before breaking. This is where Braun's true nature becomes visible again, not as a distant overseer, but as an active participant in cruelty. He is not observing passively anymore. He is playing. The tasks he assigns inside Tranquility Lane are not random. They are structured expressions of his philosophy. They force the player to confront the ease with which ordinary people can be pushed into harming others when authority frames it as necessary or trivial. Neighbors become tools. Relationships become leverage. Violence becomes procedural. And the most disturbing part is how quickly the system tries to normalize it. Braun does not need to shout. He does not need to threaten overtly. He simply guides. And guidance, inside a controlled environment, becomes indistinguishable from coercion. The Wanderer, unlike the original residents, retains something Braun did not anticipate fully: perspective. Memory of an external world where choices still carry authentic weight. That difference becomes the crack inside Tranquility Lane's structure. Because Braun's system depends on long-term psychological erosion. It depends on people forgetting alternatives exist. The Wanderer remembers alternatives. And that is enough to destabilize the entire simulation. James, meanwhile, represents the emotional cost of resistance. A man who entered seeking help and instead became trapped inside a system that turns human consciousness into malleable material. His presence inside Tranquility Lane becomes a symbol of everything Braun consumes but cannot fully understand. Genuine sacrifice, genuine hope, the kind of motivation that does not exist for experimentation, only for survival. Braun cannot replicate that. He can only observe it and attempt to break it. But even within his godlike control, something begins to shift. Because control is only absolute until it is questioned. And the Wanderer begins to question everything. The introduction of the failsafe is where Vault 112 reveals its final contradiction. The Chinese invasion program is not just a hidden switch or a backup protocol. It is a symbolic inversion of Braun's entire system. a mechanism that uses fear of external collapse to destroy internal tyranny. It is fitting in a world built on paranoia. The pre-war United States was defined by imagined enemies, foreign threats, ideological invasions, endless preparation for conflicts that blurred the line between reality and propaganda. Vault-Tec itself thrived on that paranoia, turning fear into infrastructure, turning anxiety into architecture. The failsafe is the ultimate expression of that mindset, a weaponized myth embedded inside reality. And when activated, it does something Braun never fully accounted for. It introduces unpredictability. Tranquility Lane begins to fracture. The perfect suburban loops destabilize. The controlled environment loses coherence. And for the first time in centuries, Braun is no longer the sole author of reality inside his domain. That realization is psychologically catastrophic for him, because Braun's identity is not simply tied to control, it is dependent on it. Without absolute authority over the simulation, he is not a god. He is not even a scientist in any meaningful sense anymore. He becomes something far more fragile. A mind that has spent centuries insulating itself from consequence, suddenly forced to confront the possibility of failure. And failure, for someone like Braun, is not just loss of power, it is annihilation of meaning. This is why his reaction to the lone wanderer shifts so sharply once the failsafe enters play. The playful cruelty begins to thin, the casual confidence fractures. Beneath the mask of Betty, something older and more unstable begins to surface. Not remorse, not empathy, but something closer to panic disguised as irritation. The system he perfected is slipping, and he knows it. When the Wanderer ultimately breaks the simulation, either through resistance or activation of the override, the collapse of Tranquility Lane is not just a technical failure. It is the symbolic end of Braun's illusion of divinity. For over 200 years, he believed he had transcended vulnerability. In a single moment, that belief is proven false. But even that does not fully resolve the moral complexity of Vault 112, because freedom inside this system is not clean. It is not restorative. The residents are not simply returned to their original lives. Those lives are gone, erased by time, corrupted by centuries of artificial existence. What remains is survival without restoration, a world where escape does not equal healing. That ambiguity is essential to Fallout's tone. Nothing is ever fully repaired, only exposed. Braun's legacy, therefore, cannot be measured only in terms of cruelty or defeat. It must be understood as a structural failure of ideology. He represents the endpoint of a belief system that prioritizes control over understanding, stability over humanity, observation over compassion. Vault-Tec built the framework. Braun simply followed it to its logical extreme. And in doing so, he revealed what was always waiting beneath it. That preservation without humanity is indistinguishable from destruction. That control without empathy becomes indistinguishable from torture. And that intelligence without moral grounding does not elevate civilization. It hollows it. Even after his influence is broken inside Tranquility Lane, the deeper question remains unresolved across the wider Fallout universe. How many other systems like Vault 112 still exist beneath the ruins of America? How many other experiments continue running without oversight? How many other minds, human or otherwise, have inherited the same belief that suffering is acceptable if it produces results? Braun is not an anomaly. He is a symptom, a concentrated expression of a world that already accepted too many compromises long before the bombs fell. And that is why Vault 112 lingers long after the simulation ends. Because even when the neighborhood disappears, the idea behind it does not. The idea that reality can be rewritten, that people can be managed, that control is safer than freedom. And somewhere in the silence, after the simulation collapses, that idea continues to echo through the wasteland like a warning that was never fully heard, not from Braun alone, but from the world that created him. Even after the collapse of Tranquility Lane, the vault does not feel like something truly finished. It feels interrupted, as if Braun's influence never fully stops so much as it briefly loses its shape. That lingering unease is important because Vault 112 was never just a location in the capital wasteland. It was a system designed to outlast normal understanding of time, morality, and consequence. When the lone wanderer forces its disruption, what actually happens is not simple destruction, it is fragmentation. Pieces of Braun's reality remain, even if the structure itself fails. And that idea matters more than the physical vault, because Dr. Stanislaus Braun did not merely build a prison for others. He built a framework for control that, in theory, could be replicated anywhere intelligence, technology, and isolation intersect. The wanderer, stepping out of Tranquility Lane, is often treated as a moment of victory, but in the deeper sense of Fallout storytelling, it is something more complicated. It is escape from a localized nightmare, not removal of the philosophy that created it. The simulation ends, but the world that allowed it to exist remains intact above ground. A world still filled with people who, in their own ways, continue to rationalize control. That is why Vault 112 feels like a warning rather than a closed chapter. Inside the vault, Braun demonstrated how easily human beings can be reduced when they are fully separated from external accountability. Outside the vault, the wasteland demonstrates how often similar reductions happen on a smaller, more fragmented scale. Raiders, factions, militarized remnants of old governments, all repeating variations of the same fundamental pattern: dominance, justified by necessity. Braun is simply the most extreme version of a mindset that never truly died. And that makes him more unsettling than many of Fallout's other antagonists, because he does not rely on ideology in the traditional sense. He does not preach salvation. He does not claim moral superiority in abstract philosophical terms. He simply acts. And over time, action becomes habit. Habit becomes identity. Identity becomes system. Inside Tranquility Lane, that system reaches its final form: a loop without exit, a society without evolution, a consciousness without external correction. Everything stabilizes around Braun's presence, not because it is healthy, but because nothing else is allowed to disrupt it long enough to create change. That is the core difference between survival and stagnation. Survival implies movement forward, adaptation, evolution. Stagnation is survival without direction. Vault 112 is stagnation perfected, and Braun is its permanent administrator. Even the residents who resist internally, who remember fragments of their past lives, or feel instinctive discomfort at the simulation's perfection, eventually find themselves absorbed back into its rhythm. Not because they accept it, but because resistance inside a closed system without allies eventually becomes exhausting. Psychological pressure does not need to break everyone instantly. It only needs to outlast them. Braun has centuries. That imbalance is absolute. It is easy, from an external perspective, to view Braun as simply a monster, but Fallout consistently complicates that interpretation, because monsters in this universe are rarely born fully formed. They are assembled slowly through systems that reward detachment and punish empathy. Braun is terrifying not only because of what he becomes, but because the conditions that created him are recognizable. A collapsing civilization, scientific ambition without ethical grounding, institutional willingness to treat human life as experimental material, fear of extinction overriding moral restraint. These are not fictional exaggerations within Fallout's world. They are extensions of real tendencies, pushed beyond safe limits. Vault 112 just removes the remaining barriers, and what is left is a pure demonstration of what happens when observation replaces compassion entirely. The lone wanderer's intrusion into that system therefore carries symbolic weight beyond the immediate narrative. They are not just a protagonist completing a quest. They are an external correction entering a sealed moral experiment. A variable Braun did not simulate fully. A reminder that no system, no matter how controlled, can account for every form of human unpredictability, especially not empathy expressed through action rather than theory. James embodies that empathy in its most fragile form. a man trying to restore water to a broken world, even after witnessing how easily systems of power can be corrupted. His presence inside Vault 112 highlights the contrast between two scientific philosophies that diverged long before the bombs fell. One believes knowledge exists to improve lives. The other believes knowledge exists to control them. Braun chose the latter and never left it. And because he never left it, he eventually became indistinguishable from it. That is why, even after his defeat inside Tranquility Lane, his character does not feel fully resolved in the traditional sense. There is no redemption arc, no final understanding, no moment of clarity where he recognizes the harm he has caused and steps away from it. Fallout rarely grants that kind of closure to figures who reach his level of moral collapse. Instead, there is only exposure. The system is revealed, the illusion is broken, and the consequences are left to the wasteland. What remains after Vault 112 is not healing, but awareness. The knowledge that somewhere beneath the ruins, a mind once reshaped reality into a playground of controlled suffering. A reminder that technology did not fail humanity in a sudden moment of apocalypse. It eroded it gradually until systems like Braun's became possible at all. And that realization extends far beyond one vault. It forces a broader reflection on the entire structure of Fallout's world. If one isolated experiment could produce something like Tranquility Lane, then how many other vaults carried similar distortions? How many other scientific minds, given enough isolation and authority, would arrive at similar conclusions? How many systems designed for preservation quietly evolved into systems of control simply because no one remained capable of stopping them? These questions linger because the universe does not provide full reassurance. It provides patterns, repeated failures of authority, repeated misuse of technology, repeated collapse of moral frameworks under pressure. Braun is one node in that pattern, not an exception to it. And that is what makes Vault 112 so important in the larger Fallout narrative. It is not just a story about one man's descent into godhood. It is a demonstration of what godhood looks like when stripped of empathy, accountability, and time-bound consequence. A God who cannot leave his creation, a creation that cannot leave its God, a loop that feeds on itself until intervention breaks it from the outside. Even then, the break is not clean, because systems like that do not vanish easily. They leave behind echoes in the way survivors think, the way factions justify power, the way new societies rebuild old mistakes under different names. Braun may be gone from Tranquility Lane in a direct sense, but the logic that sustained him remains embedded in the wider wasteland, in every attempt to rebuild order through force, in every experiment justified by necessity, in every moment where control feels easier than trust. That is his real legacy, not the simulation itself, but the idea that created it. And ideas, unlike vaults, are not sealed behind steel doors. They spread, they adapt, they survive. Long after the last resident leaves the fake suburban streets behind, and long after the lone wanderer steps back into the ruined sunlight of the capital wasteland, the echo of Vault 112 continues to exist in a quieter, more uncomfortable form. Not as a place, but as a question that never fully stops being asked. What happens when someone decides that human beings are only worth preserving if they can be controlled? And in the silence that follows, Fallout refuses to answer it directly, because the world it depicts already has. The silence that follows the collapse of Tranquility Lane is not empty. It is heavy, not because sound is absent, but because meaning has been stripped from everything that once carried it. The cheerful suburb that once functioned as Braun's private universe does not simply disappear like a broken illusion. It dissolves in layers, like reality itself is unsure whether it was ever supposed to exist in the first place. And for a brief moment, even time feels uncertain inside Vault 112. The lone wanderer stands at the center of something that no longer behaves like a place. The houses are still there, but they no longer feel inhabited in any meaningful sense. The streets remain, but their purpose has been hollowed out. Even the sky above Tranquility Lane, once artificially comforting, now feels like a thin sheet of borrowed color stretched over something deeper and more unstable. It is in this fragile aftermath that the full weight of Dr. Stanislaus Braun's existence becomes clearer than ever. Because Braun does not vanish as an idea when the simulation is disrupted, he disperses, like a consciousness that refuses to accept termination. For over 2 centuries, Braun existed as the single stabilizing intelligence of Vault 112. Every rule, every consequence, every emotional reaction inside Tranquility Lane was filtered through him. The simulation did not merely respond to residents. It responded to Braun's interpretation of them, his desires, his boredom, his curiosity, his need for control. That level of centralization creates something fragile at its core. Because when everything depends on one mind, the collapse of that mind's authority does not just end a system, it destabilizes reality within that system. And that is exactly what the Lone Wanderer triggers. Not simply resistance, but a structural contradiction inside Braun's godhood. For the first time in centuries, he is forced to experience limitation again. Not the gentle limitations of pre-war institutions, not bureaucratic oversight or scientific ethics committees, but absolute, unavoidable loss of control over a reality he believed belonged entirely to him. That loss does not arrive all at once. It fractures. At first, small inconsistencies appear inside the simulation. Residents behave unpredictably. Environmental responses lag or misalign. Dialogue patterns fail to loop correctly. The perfect repetition that defined Tranquility Lane begins to stutter, like a memory struggling to maintain coherence. Braun reacts to this the way any system built on dominance reacts to instability. He tries to correct it. But correction no longer guarantees compliance. That is the moment the illusion begins to fail, not as a visual construct, but as a psychological authority. Because Tranquility Lane was never just a virtual environment. It was obedience encoded into architecture. When obedience breaks, the environment stops functioning as reality. It becomes evidence of collapse. The Lone Wanderer, unlike Braun's long-conditioned residents, does not interpret these failures as part of the world. They interpret them as signs, signals that the system itself is no longer absolute, that somewhere beneath the surface of this perfect suburb, something is malfunctioning in a way that can be exploited. That difference in perception is everything. Braun built his simulation under the assumption that all minds inside it would eventually converge towards submission. But he failed to account for minds shaped outside of his control. Minds forged in the wasteland, where reality is brutal but honest. That honesty becomes a weapon inside Vault 112. Because systems built on illusion are fragile when confronted with people who no longer trust appearances. As the Wanderer continues interacting with Betty, the mask of childish innocence begins to feel less like disguise and more like instability. Braun is no longer fully committed to the performance, yet he cannot abandon it either. After centuries of embodiment, Betty is not just an avatar, it is a psychological extension of his identity. That means any fracture in the simulation is also a fracture in Braun himself. The more control he loses, the more fragmented his expression becomes. Playful commands begin to carry undertones of irritation. Jokes feel less like entertainment and more like attempts to reassert authority. Silence stretches longer between interactions, as though Braun is recalculating not just the system, but his place inside it. And beneath that recalculation lies something he has avoided for centuries: self-reflection. But self-reflection in a mind like Braun's does not produce clarity. It produces confrontation. Because once control is no longer absolute, the question he has buried for over 200 years begins to resurface. What is he without it? The answer is something he cannot tolerate. Not a god, not a scientist in command of discovery, not a philosopher shaping human evolution, just a man who chose isolation, a man who replaced relationships with experiments, a man who mistook domination for understanding. That realization does not arrive cleanly. It manifests as resistance, irritation, escalation. The simulation becomes more aggressive in its attempts to stabilize itself, but aggression itself signals instability. Every forced correction reveals that correction is still necessary, and necessity is the opposite of godhood. The introduction of the Chinese invasion failsafe accelerates this collapse because it introduces something Braun cannot fully simulate internally: external causality, a mechanism that exists outside his narrative control. Once activated, Tranquility Lane stops behaving like a closed system and begins behaving like a compromised one. The perfect loops of suburban life degrade into repetition errors. Residents begin to show awareness that their environment is not stable. Dialogue patterns lose consistency. Emotional responses begin to deviate from expected outputs. The simulation is no longer reality. It is software breaking under contradiction, and Braun, for all his intelligence, is forced into a position he has not occupied in centuries. Problem solving without omnipotence. That shift is psychologically devastating, because his entire identity was built on the assumption that no problem inside his domain could exceed his capacity to control it. When that assumption breaks, everything built upon it begins to destabilize simultaneously. Even the concept of entertainment changes. What once amused him now feels insufficient. What once felt like experimentation now feels like repetition without purpose. What once felt like eternity now feels like confinement. This is the paradox of Vault 112. Braun built it to transcend limitation, but in transcending limitation, he eliminated the conditions required for meaning, and meaning, once lost, cannot be reconstructed through power alone. The residents of Tranquility Lane begin to sense this collapse at an instinctive level before they fully understand it intellectually. For them, the change manifests as emotional disruption. The rules feel less predictable. The environment feels less responsive. The sense of omnipresent control begins to fade, replaced by something far more dangerous inside a system like this: uncertainty. Uncertainty is the first crack in any authoritarian structure, because authority depends not only on power, but on belief in its inevitability. Once inevitability is questioned, obedience becomes optional. And once obedience becomes optional, fear loses its structural foundation. Inside Vault 112, that collapse is amplified by centuries of conditioning. The residents were not trained to resist Braun in a single generation. They were shaped over multiple simulated lifetimes into acceptance. Entire identities were built around the assumption that resistance is futile, but assumptions do not survive contact with contradiction, especially not contradiction introduced from outside the system. The lone wanderer represents that contradiction in its purest form, a human being who does not belong to Braun's logic, a variable he cannot fully predict, a presence that exists beyond the closed loop of Tranquility Lane. And that presence forces Braun into the closest thing he has experienced to vulnerability since the Great War ended the world above. He is forced to respond instead of dictate, and response, for someone like him, is unfamiliar territory. The deeper implication of this confrontation is not simply that Braun can be defeated within his system. It is that his system was never as complete as he believed. Vault Tech's architecture, for all its ambition, still contained fractures, safeguards, fail-safes, hidden mechanisms that could override even the most centralized authority under specific conditions. Whether designed intentionally or as accidental redundancy, those mechanisms represent a truth Braun spent centuries ignoring. No system is truly absolute, not even his. And that truth collapses something fundamental inside his worldview. Because if control can be interrupted, then control is not divinity. It is maintenance, and maintenance can fail. The moment the simulation begins breaking beyond repair, Braun's identity enters its final stage of disintegration. The God complex does not vanish instantly. It resists, it adapts. It attempts to reassert dominance through increasing instability. but each attempt only accelerates the breakdown, because authority that must constantly prove itself is no longer authority, it is desperation. And desperation is something Braun has spent centuries believing he had evolved beyond. The irony is almost complete. A man who spent 200 years studying human behavior ultimately becomes trapped by the same psychological patterns he believed he had transcended. Control becomes addiction. Authority becomes dependency. The simulation becomes both his greatest achievement and his final confinement. When the system finally collapses, whether through the Wanderer's intervention or internal failure, what remains of Braun is not a fallen god in the dramatic sense. It is something quieter, something far more unsettling, a consciousness suddenly stripped of its primary function, a mind that no longer has a world to control, a presence that spent centuries defining itself through dominance, now forced into existence without anything left to dominate in the same way. That transition is not explored fully in any clean resolution, because Fallout rarely allows clean psychological endings for characters like him. Instead, it leaves implication that somewhere within the fractured remnants of Vault 112, echoes of Braun's awareness may still persist, not necessarily as a fully functioning god, but as a fragmented intelligence shaped too long by artificial reality to simply disappear without consequence, because systems like Tranquility Lane do not erase consciousness easily. They degrade it, they scatter it, they leave behind patterns that may or may not ever fully resolve. And that uncertainty is where Vault 112 becomes something larger than its own narrative. It becomes a reflection of Fallout's most persistent philosophical concern. That intelligence without morality does not produce enlightenment. It produces systems of control that eventually consume both subject and creator. Braun is not just a warning about technology. He is a warning about interpretation, about what happens when observation replaces empathy, when analysis replaces understanding, when control replaces meaning, and when eternity is granted to a mind that was never prepared to live inside it. Even after all disruption ends, even after the Wanderer leaves, even after the simulation collapses into silence, Vault 112 does not feel resolved. It feels suspended, as if something inside it is still thinking, still calculating, still remembering the shape of a world it once owned completely. And that lingering presence is what makes Braun unforgettable in Fallout's universe, not because he conquered anything, but because he demonstrated what happens when a human mind is given infinite time, infinite control, and no longer has anything external capable of telling it no. The answer is not evolution, it is stagnation, endless, careful, smiling, and buried beneath a perfect suburban sky that never truly existed at all. And yet, even after everything inside Vault 112 collapses, there is still a sense that something unresolved remains beneath the surface, not in a supernatural way, not as ghosts or lingering spirits, but as structure, as pattern, as memory encoded into systems that were never designed to forget. Because Vault-Tec experiments were not isolated incidents, they were part of a wider philosophy that treated human behavior as something measurable under extreme conditions. Braun did not invent that philosophy. He refined it to a point where it stopped resembling science and started resembling ideology. And ideology, once embedded into infrastructure, does not disappear when individuals are removed. It persists in the architecture of decision-making that created it. That is why Vault 112 continues to matter even after Braun's control is broken. It is not just a story about one man becoming a tyrant inside a simulation. It is a demonstration of how easily systems designed for preservation can invert themselves into systems of perpetual containment. The residents of Tranquility Lane are not just victims of Braun. They are also victims of assumptions made long before they ever entered the vault. The assumption that control equals safety. The assumption that observation equals understanding. The assumption that removing unpredictability from human life will produce stability instead of stagnation. Every one of those assumptions collapses inside the simulation. But the collapse does not undo the harm already done, because time inside Vault 112 does not behave like normal time. 2 centuries of simulated existence cannot be mentally compressed into a single moment of escape. Even after the Wanderer disrupts Braun's authority, the residents do not simply return to who they were. That version of them no longer exists in any meaningful sense. What remains are fractured continuities of identity, people shaped by repeated cycles of artificial experience, minds that have lived through generations of imposed reality without ever aging in a normal social context. That is one of the most understated horrors of Braun's system. It does not merely imprison people. It rewrites the baseline of what existence feels like. And once that baseline is rewritten, there is no clean return. The wasteland outside Vault 112 continues functioning under its own brutality, but at least its brutality is honest. Raiders do not disguise themselves as neighbors. Radiation does not pretend to be safety. Death does not arrive under the illusion of comfort. Tranquility Lane does the opposite. It turns safety into a mask for control, and that inversion is what makes it psychologically corrosive. Because the human mind is not built to constantly question whether comfort is real or manufactured, it eventually either accepts the environment or breaks under sustained contradiction. Braun's experiment forces every resident into that impossible middle state for centuries. Neither fully adapted nor fully free, just suspended in a controlled loop of emotional instability. Even Braun himself is trapped inside that loop, though he would never have described it that way. From his perspective, everything inside the simulation is functioning exactly as intended. The residents continue to respond, the environment continues to produce data, the system continues to operate under his authority. But that interpretation only holds if one ignores the gradual erosion of meaning beneath the surface. Because over time, even perfect control becomes indistinguishable from repetition. And repetition without variation eventually becomes indistinguishable from emptiness. That is the subtle collapse happening beneath Braun's God complex, long before the lone wanderer ever arrives. He is no longer expanding understanding. He is maintaining a closed circuit of behavior, a loop that feeds only on itself. And loops, no matter how sophisticated, eventually stop producing new information. They only recycle existing patterns. That realization, if Braun ever fully acknowledged it, would be devastating, because it would mean that centuries of observation did not lead to enlightenment. They led to stagnation disguised as progress. But Braun avoids that conclusion by doing what he has always done: reframing, reinterpreting, reasserting control over meaning itself. If the system feels repetitive, it is because subjects are predictable. If subjects are predictable, it is because human nature is stable. If human nature is stable, then the experiment confirms his worldview. This circular logic protects him from confronting the possibility that the system itself is the problem. Not the subjects, not the residents, not the wasteland, but the structure he built to contain them. And that is why the intrusion of the lone wanderer matters so profoundly, because it introduces something Braun cannot fully reframe: genuine external contradiction, a human being who does not fit neatly into his predictive model, a consciousness shaped outside his system entirely, a decision maker who can reject authority without being conditioned to obey it. That kind of presence is dangerous not because it is powerful in a traditional sense, but because it exposes the limits of Braun's assumptions. And once limits are visible, divinity collapses into machinery. The moment Braun loses full narrative control of Tranquility Lane, he is forced into a reactive state that exposes something he has spent centuries suppressing. He is not omniscient. He is not omnipotent. He is simply the most persistent intelligence inside a closed system that is finally beginning to fail. That distinction is everything, because omnipotence cannot be threatened, but persistence can be interrupted, and interruption is exactly what the lone wanderer brings. Once the failsafe begins to destabilize the simulation, Braun's behavior shifts into increasingly unstable patterns that reveal the psychological dependency he has developed on absolute control. The God complex is not just arrogance at this stage, it has become structural. It is embedded in how he interprets reality itself. When control weakens, his interpretation of self weakens with it. That is why his reaction feels less like anger and more like unraveling. He is not simply losing a system, he is losing the only framework through which he understands existence. And that is far more destabilizing than defeat. Because defeat implies continuation in another form, but loss of framework implies conceptual collapse. The mind has nothing left to anchor itself to. Inside that collapse, the line between Braun and the simulation begins to blur in reverse. For centuries, he treated Tranquility Lane as an extension of himself. Now, as it destabilizes, he becomes an extension of it. His identity is no longer above the system, it is entangled with its failure. This is where Fallout's broader philosophical tone becomes especially sharp. It is not just about ruined worlds. It is about systems that consume the people who build them. Vault 112 is not an exception to that pattern. It is one of its most refined expressions. Even after Braun's authority breaks, the system he created does not simply vanish cleanly. It degrades unevenly. Residual logic patterns remain. Behavioral echoes persist. Environmental inconsistencies continue for a time, suggesting that the simulation itself is not a single entity but a layered structure of overlapping control mechanisms. In other words, Braun was never the only thing maintaining Tranquility Lane. He was the central node in a system that may have already developed its own inertia. That possibility adds another layer of discomfort to the ending, because it suggests that even without him, the structure of controlled reality might continue operating in degraded form, repeating fragments of behavior without understanding their purpose. A dead system continuing to simulate life. And in Fallout, that idea is never presented as purely hypothetical. It is consistent with how technology behaves across the entire world. Robots continue operating long after their creators die. Facilities continue running without oversight. Protocols execute without interpretation. Systems do not require consciousness to persist. They only require power and structure. Vault 112 is simply the most intimate version of that principle. A machine designed not for industry or defense, but for human experience itself. And once human experience is mechanized, it becomes indistinguishable from containment. That is the final implication of Braun's legacy. Not that he became powerful, but that he proved how easily experience itself can be converted into a system of control if enough technological and psychological leverage is applied. And once that conversion is complete, reversing it becomes nearly impossible without destroying the entire structure, which is exactly what the Lone Wanderer ultimately triggers. Not restoration, not healing, but disruption severe enough to break continuity. And even that disruption does not erase the deeper philosophical problem Fallout keeps returning to. Because Vault 112 is not the only place where reality has been reshaped into something controlled, predictable, and artificial. It is simply the place where that transformation is most visible in its purest form. A suburban paradise that never existed. A god who never learned empathy. A population preserved without freedom. And a world outside that continues to repeat similar patterns in less extreme, less visible ways. Which leaves the final impression not as closure, but as recognition. That Braun was never an isolated anomaly buried beneath the wasteland. He was a concentrated expression of a much older tendency, the desire to replace uncertainty with control, and to call that replacement progress, even when everything human inside it slowly disappears. And still, even after that recognition settles in, Vault 112 refuses to feel fully understood, because understanding implies containment, and nothing about Braun's system was ever truly contained in the way people expect systems to be. What existed inside Tranquility Lane was not just a simulation running on hardware beneath a vault floor. It was a layered psychological environment that blurred the boundary between programmed behavior and learned behavior. Over centuries, the residents did not simply respond to Braun, they adapted around him. They evolved internal coping mechanisms, emotional shortcuts, and survival instincts tailored specifically to a reality that should never have existed in the first place. That means, when the system collapses, what collapses is not only software, it is an entire ecosystem of conditioned human response. And ecosystems do not simply reset when one variable is removed. They leave residue. The wanderer stepping out of Vault 112 is often framed as an exit point, but in a deeper sense, it is more like crossing a threshold from one type of unreality into another. The wasteland is real in a physical sense, but it is still shaped by the aftermath of systems like Braun's. The pre-war world built the vaults shaped the wasteland then inherits fragments of both. Everything is connected through damage. That is one of Fallout's most consistent and unsettling structural ideas. Nothing begins cleanly, nothing ends cleanly, everything is continuation. Braun's simulation is simply one of the most compressed examples of that continuity loop. It takes pre-war ideology, isolates it, intensifies it, and then removes all external correction. What remains is not a new creation, but an accelerated version of existing tendencies. That is why the suburbs of Tranquility Lane feel so familiar even when they are wrong. They are familiar because they are not imaginary. They are reconstructed memory, a distorted reflection of an ideal that never actually existed in real human history, but was constantly marketed as if it did. Clean neighborhoods, stable families, predictable routines, emotional safety achieved through structure. It is a fantasy built on selective omission, and Vault Tech turned that fantasy into architecture. Braun turned it into a cage. The most disturbing part is how easily the transformation occurs once the environment is closed. There is no dramatic moment where Tranquility Lane becomes a nightmare. There is no single point where innocence is lost. Instead, it gradually reveals itself as what it always was under the surface: a controlled system of emotional regulation enforced through omnipresent authority. That slow revelation mirrors how real, authoritarian systems function in Fallout's broader universe. Control rarely appears as overt violence at first. It appears as order, as safety, as stability. Only later does it reveal the cost of that stability. Inside Vault 112, the cost is total psychological captivity. And Braun is not separate from that system. He is integrated into it so deeply that separating him from it becomes almost conceptually difficult. The longer he exists inside Tranquility Lane, the less meaningful any distinction between creator and creation becomes. He is not merely controlling the simulation, he is also being shaped by it. That is one of the most subtle implications of his extended existence. Immortality does not simply preserve personality, it amplifies it in isolation. Without external reference points, identity begins to loop inward. Thoughts reinforce themselves, preferences harden into compulsions, curiosity narrows into fixation. Braun's fixation is control, and over centuries, that fixation stops being a choice and becomes structure, a psychological architecture that defines how he interprets everything. Even boredom becomes something that must be managed through dominance. Even silence becomes something that must be filled with manipulation. Even time itself becomes something to be segmented into experiments and games. In that sense, Braun is not simply an individual with power. He is a system of reinforcement pretending to be an individual. And systems of reinforcement do not require morality to continue operating. They only require consistency. That consistency is what the lone wanderer ultimately disrupts, not by overpowering Braun in a traditional sense, but by introducing inconsistency into a closed loop that had been stable for far too long. Once inconsistency enters, the loop can no longer maintain equilibrium, and equilibrium loss inside a system that depends on absolute control does not produce adaptation. It produces collapse. The emotional tone of that collapse is important because it is not explosive in the way many fictional defeats are. There is no dramatic external destruction of Vault 112 as a structure. Instead, there is a gradual unraveling of coherence, meaning disassembles before matter does. Authority dissolves before infrastructure fails. That order matters because it shows that Braun's true power was never physical. It was interpretive. He controlled meaning, and when meaning stops being stable, control becomes impossible to sustain. Even after that collapse, however, Vault 112 does not feel fully erased from Fallout's world. It continues to exist as a conceptual echo, a reference point for what happens when systems designed for preservation become environments for psychological erosion. Other vaults in the series may not replicate Tranquility Lane exactly, but they often reflect variations of the same underlying principle. Isolation combined with experimentation produces unintended consequences. Authority without oversight leads to moral distortion. Technology without ethical anchoring becomes indifferent to suffering. Braun is simply the most concentrated expression of those patterns. That is why his story does not feel like an isolated horror vignette. It feels like a case study embedded within a larger historical failure, a demonstration of what happens when enough small ethical compromises accumulate into something irreversible. And even though the lone wanderer disrupts his system, the broader implication remains intact. The conditions that produced Braun still exist in the world above. Wasteland societies continue to experiment with control in different forms, some through force, some through ideology, some through survival necessity. Each one carries fragments of the same logic that allowed Vault 112 to function for so long without external correction. The difference is scale, not principle, and that makes Braun's legacy more uncomfortable than simple villainy would suggest, because he is not a warning about one individual losing their humanity. He is a warning about what happens when humanity collectively agrees to treat control as a substitute for understanding. Inside Tranquility Lane, that agreement is enforced, absolutely. Outside it, the agreement is fragmented, but still present in different forms. Which means the true boundary between Vault and Wasteland is not as sharp as it appears. It is only more visible underground. As the lone wanderer moves further away from Vault 112, the memory of the place does not fade in a clean way. It lingers as a kind of cognitive afterimage. Not because the environment was visually shocking, but because it was emotionally dissonant. It forces the mind to reconcile comfort with cruelty in a way that does not resolve easily. That unresolved tension is what keeps the vault present in the narrative long after it is left behind. It becomes less a location and more a reference point for interpreting other systems of control throughout the wasteland. Every time the player encounters a group that enforces order through coercion, a fragment of Tranquility Lane echoes in the background. Every time a faction justifies harm through necessity, Braun's philosophy reappears in diluted form. Every time a system prioritizes stability over autonomy, the Vault's logic resurfaces. That is how Fallout constructs continuity across its world, not through direct repetition, but through thematic resonance. And Braun's resonance is particularly persistent because it touches something fundamental. The fear that safety achieved through control may not be safety at all, only a slower form of disappearance. By the time everything is considered together, Vault 112 stops functioning as a story about one man or one experiment. It becomes a structural mirror held up to the entire idea of civilization rebuilding itself after collapse. It asks whether rebuilding without reflection simply recreates the same conditions that led to destruction in the first place. And it refuses to answer that question cleanly, because the answer depends on what future systems choose to become, not what Braun became, but what comes after him. And even now, after pushing through every layer of Tranquility Lane's collapse, there is still something unsettling about how quiet the idea of it becomes once you step far enough away. Not because it is forgotten, but because it is absorbed. Vault 112 does not remain as a single sharp memory in the narrative of the wasteland. It diffuses into the broader understanding of how the world works. It becomes part of the background logic of Fallout's universe, the same way radiation becomes part of the air, or old-world technology becomes part of scavenged survival. It is not always visible, but it is always present. That is the most important stage of Braun's legacy, not the simulation itself, not the residents, not even the moment of collapse, but the way his experiment quietly integrates into the moral structure of the world afterward. Because once a system like Tranquility Lane is revealed to be possible, it changes how every other system is interpreted. It shifts the baseline of what people assume technology is capable of. It proves that reality can be fully constructed, fully controlled, and fully manipulated without immediate detection by those inside it. That knowledge does not disappear when the vault is left behind. It spreads, slowly, unevenly, like a thought that refuses to stop repeating. And in that sense, Braun's greatest impact is not what he did inside Vault 112. It is what he demonstrated was possible. That demonstration reshapes how control is understood across the entire Fallout setting. Factions that prioritize order begin to resemble smaller versions of his philosophy. Even when they do not share his technology, they often share his assumption that human behavior can be improved through restriction. That assumption is the real inheritance, not the vault, not the simulation, but the belief that freedom is a variable that can be optimized away. Inside Tranquility Lane, that belief reaches its purest form. The residents are not just controlled physically, they are controlled socially, emotionally, and structurally until deviation itself feels unnatural. Even thoughts that stray too far from the expected pattern are corrected through environmental pressure. That level of control is not sustainable in an open system, but inside a sealed system like Vault 112, it becomes self-reinforcing because there is no external feedback loop to challenge it, no outside culture to contradict it, no alternative reality to compare against. Everything inside the simulation becomes internally justified. That is why Braun's authority feels so absolute for so long. It is not that he is infallible, it is that he is unchallenged. And unchallenged systems do not remain neutral. They drift, always toward extremes. Over centuries, that drift transforms Tranquility Lane from an experiment into a ritual. Interactions lose variability. Outcomes lose unpredictability. Even suffering becomes standardized because it is repeated often enough to become familiar. At that point, the simulation is no longer testing behavior, it is reproducing it. And Braun is no longer experimenting on people. He is maintaining a pattern of behavior that has become its own justification. That is the final stage of systems like this in Fallout's logic, when the system no longer serves its original purpose, but continues anyway because it has become self-validating. The Lone Wanderer disrupts that self-validation by introducing something the system cannot process cleanly: genuine refusal, not scripted resistance, not conditioned rebellion, but refusal that exists outside the expected behavioral model entirely. And refusal is dangerous to any system built on total predictability, because refusal does not negotiate, it does not optimize, it does not fit into correction cycles. It simply breaks the assumption that compliance is inevitable. Once that assumption breaks, everything built on top of it begins to destabilize. That destabilization is what allows Tranquility Lane to finally fracture. But even that fracture does not restore balance in any meaningful sense. It simply exposes how fragile the balance always was. The illusion of stability was maintained not by strength, but by isolation. Remove isolation, and the structure reveals its dependency. That dependency is Braun himself, which means the collapse of the simulation is also the collapse of his role within it. And when that role collapses, what remains is not clarity or enlightenment, but exposure. Exposure of how much of his identity was built entirely on uninterrupted authority. There is no version of Braun that exists outside that authority that has been meaningfully developed over 2 centuries of isolation. There is no alternate self waiting beneath the surface. There is only the accumulation of behavior reinforced endlessly by a system that never said no. That is why his downfall does not resemble redemption or transformation. It resembles disassembly. Piece by piece, the identity loses its structural supports. Control fails, narrative control fails, self-definition fails, and without those layers, what remains is not a god, or a scientist, or even a villain in the traditional sense. It is simply a consciousness that no longer has a stable framework to organize itself around. Fallout rarely lingers on that kind of psychological aftermath in explicit terms, but it is embedded in the way Vault 112 is framed as part of a larger, ongoing world. Nothing truly ends in isolation. Everything continues somewhere else in altered form. That includes Braun's influence. Even if the simulation is broken, even if Tranquility Lane is no longer functioning, the conceptual architecture of what he built remains relevant to understanding other systems in the wasteland. Any structure that relies on total control, total isolation, and total behavioral prediction carries echoes of the same foundational logic. Not identical, but related, and that relation is enough for the comparison to persist. Which is why Vault 112 cannot be treated as a self-contained horror story. It is a lens, a way of interpreting how power behaves when it is left unchecked long enough in an environment without correction. The most unsettling part is that Braun never needed to be uniquely evil for this to occur. He only needed to be left alone with sufficient tools and sufficient time. Everything else followed from those conditions. That is the part that remains long after the simulation ends. Not the spectacle of Tranquility Lane, not the games, not even the collapse, but the recognition that under the right conditions, any sufficiently isolated intelligence might begin to reproduce similar structures of control. That possibility is what lingers in the background of Fallout's universe, quiet, unresolved, and difficult to fully dismiss. Because once seen, it changes how every other vault, every other experiment, and every other system of authority is interpreted. And somewhere far beneath the wasteland, in the conceptual shadow left behind by Vault 112, that question continues to exist without resolution, not as a warning that is being actively spoken, but as a conclusion that has not yet stopped unfolding. And long after the Wanderer leaves Vault 112 behind, the silence that follows does not feel like closure. It feels like distance. The kind of distance that does not reduce importance, but instead stretches meaning thin enough that it becomes harder to grasp all at once. Tranquility Lane stops existing as a place the moment you leave it, but it continues existing as an idea that refuses to stay contained in a single moment of experience. Because what Braun created was never meant to remain confined to one vault. It was a demonstration of possibility, and possibility is the most persistent form of influence in the Fallout universe. Outside the collapse simulation, the capital wasteland continues its uneven rhythm of survival. Settlements form and break apart. Factions argue over control. Technology is scavenged, repurposed, and misunderstood. People rebuild fragments of civilization while never fully escaping the logic of the world that created the apocalypse in the first place. That continuity matters, because Vault 112 does not exist in isolation from that world. It is part of the same historical momentum that led to it, the same pre-war anxieties, the same scientific arrogance, the same belief that systems can replace morality if they are engineered precisely enough. Braun is simply one of the clearest expressions of that belief taken to its logical endpoint. Inside Tranquility Lane, that belief becomes absolute reality. Every element of life is filtered through control. Every interaction is shaped by observation. Every moment of existence is measured against an invisible standard that only one mind defines. The residents do not simply live inside a simulation. They live inside interpretation itself. An interpretation controlled by a single consciousness does not remain neutral for long. It becomes doctrine. Over centuries, doctrine replaces spontaneity. Spontaneity replaces authenticity. And authenticity eventually disappears entirely. That is the final state of Braun's experiment. Not chaos, not collapse, but perfected repetition. A loop so stable that it no longer requires justification, only continuation. The arrival of the lone wanderer disrupts that continuity in a way that cannot be absorbed into the system. Not because they are stronger or more intelligent or more morally righteous in a simple sense, but because they exist outside the feedback loop that defines Tranquility Lane. They are not shaped by it. They do not reinforce it. They do not complete it. They interrupt it. And interruption is something Braun's system was never truly designed to handle for long periods of time. Once interruption becomes persistent, control begins to degrade into reaction. And reaction is always a sign that authority is no longer absolute. That shift changes everything about how Braun exists within his own creation. He is no longer simply the observer or the architect. He becomes a participant in instability. Every decision he makes begins to carry the weight of uncertainty. Every attempt to correct deviation introduces new forms of unpredictability. The system stops reflecting his will cleanly. It starts resisting it. And resistance inside a closed system is not just a technical issue, it is an existential one. Because Braun's identity is inseparable from the assumption that his system cannot meaningfully oppose him. Once that assumption breaks, he is forced into a state that resembles something he has not experienced in centuries. Equality with the system he created. Not moral equality, not philosophical equality, but structural equality. The realization that he is no longer above the environment, but inside it. That shift collapses the illusion of godhood more effectively than any external force could. And what remains is not a triumphant defeat, but a quiet reclassification of what he actually is. A mind inside a failing structure, a consciousness that mistook control for transcendence. A scientist who built a world that eventually stopped needing him in the way he assumed it would. Even the failsafe, when activated, does not simply function as a tool of liberation. It functions as a correction to overconfidence. A reminder embedded in the system itself that no simulation, no matter how carefully constructed, is immune to contradiction. The Chinese invasion protocol is not just narrative device. It is structural humility coded into an otherwise arrogant design. It is the vault acknowledging its own potential failure before it even occurs. And when that correction is triggered, everything inside Tranquility Lane begins to reveal what it was always capable of becoming beneath the surface. Not a paradise, not a prison in the traditional sense, but a fragile construct maintained by uninterrupted belief in authority. Once that belief is disrupted, the construct cannot maintain coherence, and coherence is the only thing separating illusion from collapse. Braun's response to that collapse is not simple rage or defeat. It is something more psychologically fragmented, because what he is losing is not just control over people, but control over meaning itself. The ability to define what things are, what events represent, what outcomes signify. Without that ability, intelligence loses its central function inside his worldview, and intelligence without function becomes something he can no longer fully categorize. That is where the true erosion begins, not in the environment, but in interpretation. Because once interpretation becomes unstable, reality itself becomes unstable for the observer. The residents experience this differently. For them, the collapse is less conceptual and more emotional. The certainty that defined their existence begins to dissolve. The rules that govern their behavior stop feeling consistent. The sense that the world is predictable begins to fail at a subconscious level before they can fully articulate why. And in that failure, something long suppressed begins to surface again. Choice. Not scripted choice, not guided choice, but the uncomfortable return of uncertainty about what comes next, even if that uncertainty is limited, even if it is constrained by the structure of the vault. It represents a rupture in the illusion of total control. And that rupture cannot be fully repaired once it is recognized. This is why Vault 112 remains one of the most unsettling locations in Fallout's entire narrative structure, not because of what it shows, but because of what it reveals about systems that attempt to remove unpredictability from human existence. It shows that predictability is not stability, it is suspension, and suspension is always temporary. Outside the vault, the wasteland continues its own version of instability, but it is a different kind. It is chaotic, visible, and constantly shifting. Inside Tranquility Lane, instability is hidden beneath structure until it can no longer be contained. Both are forms of breakdown, just at different scales and speeds. And Braun's experiment sits between them as a bridge between old-world ambition and post-war reality. A bridge built on the assumption that control can replace understanding. That assumption fails here more visibly than almost anywhere else in Fallout's universe. And once it fails, it cannot be unseen. Even for the lone wanderer, who moves on from Vault 112, the experience does not function like a normal completed task. It lingers as an interpretive weight that changes how other systems are perceived. Encounters in the wasteland no longer feel purely isolated. They begin to echo with the possibility that beneath surface reality, other controlled environments might still exist, unseen or unrecognized. That is the final influence of Braun. Not domination, not survival, but perception. He changes how reality is interpreted after his system is gone. And that kind of influence does not require continuation of the simulation to persist. It only requires memory, which means Vault 112 remains active in a different form, not as a place, not as a running system, but as a reference point inside the mind of anyone who understands what happened there. A reminder that reality can be edited, that identity can be shaped, that control can masquerade as safety long enough to be mistaken for truth. And once that idea enters the larger understanding of the wasteland, it cannot be fully removed. It simply spreads into new interpretations of other systems, other vaults, other experiments still hidden beneath the ruins of the old world. So even when Tranquility Lane finally stops looping, it does not truly end. It disperses. And in that dispersal, Dr. Stanislaus Braun remains present not as a ruler or a god or even a clear antagonist, but as something far more difficult to resolve. A possibility that once existed, and therefore might exist again, somewhere else, under another sky, behind another perfect illusion waiting for someone new to step inside and believe, for just long enough, that control and safety are the same thing.